Britain's story begins not with a king, a conquest, or a fancy royal proclamation, but with water. A lot of water. More water than any reasonable island should have. In fact, if the weather had been even slightly better, the empire might never have happened, because nothing motivates long-term ambition like sitting on a soggy island and thinking, there must be something drier out there. Geography was Britain's first great narrative twist. While mainland Europe enjoyed the luxury of bumping elbows with neighbours, Britain was separated by the English Channel, a stretch of water so small on a map yet large enough to fundamentally reshape history. That narrow, choppy gap created a paradox. Britain was close enough to be tempted by Europe, yet far enough to sulk in its own direction. Close enough to worry about invasion, yet distant enough to feel special. It's the international equivalent of living across the street from your ex, high visibility with just enough distance to cause dramatic decisions. This island isolation mattered. Unlike countries surrounded by multiple borders, who could expand a little here, lose a little there, deal with one neighbour at a time, Britain had no land borders to absorb anxiety. If danger came, it came by sea. If opportunity came, it also came by sea. If someone was bored, well, they had to look at the sea. And when people stare at the sea long enough, two things happen. They build boats, and they start imagining what's on the other side. Before we trace the rise and fall of the British Empire, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're joining this long journey through history. Now let's begin. The British imagination, fueled by fog and fish, began to tilt outward centuries before the empire officially appeared. Even early medieval kings understood that the easiest way to avoid being conquered was to make sure the people who wanted to conquer you had a harder time getting here than staying home. Britain learned to use the Channel as a moat, its own watery force field. But moats don't just keep enemies out, they keep people inside. When you can't walk anywhere interesting, you start getting ideas. Dangerous ideas. Ambitious ideas. Let's build a ship and see who else is stuck on a damp rock ideas. The weather played its part too. There's only so much rain one society can tolerate before deciding that maybe somewhere else has sunlight. Entire generations grew up waiting for the sun to appear like it was a celebrity making a rare public sighting. It's no coincidence that an empire built by people who rarely saw clear skies eventually ended up ruling places where the sun practically lived. If there was ever a cosmic plot twist, it was Britain, home of year-round drizzle, claiming the tropics. But beyond weather complaints, Britain's geography created a deeper psychological shift, a constant, low-level paranoia. When you live on an island, every sail on the horizon looks like a possible invasion. The Vikings proved this repeatedly by showing up uninvited like the worst party guests in medieval Europe. Later, the French tried, the Spanish considered it, the Dutch briefly flirted with the idea, and everyone else looked at a map and thought, maybe someday. Britain developed a national personality built on defending itself from threats that were often real, sometimes imagined, and always feared. This defensive impulse eventually detached from reality and became an instinct. If we don't get to them first, they'll get to us. You can see how that escalates quickly. What begins as paranoia slowly transforms into ambition, and ambition turns into strategy. The empire didn't begin as a grand blueprint. It began as a nervous habit. The rugged coastline also shaped attitudes. Britain's shores are jagged, uneven, and spectacularly inconvenient for anyone who wants to dock politely. This accidentally created a culture of shipbuilders who were forced to innovate because nature refused to cooperate. When your island refuses to give you easy harbours, you either get very good at building ships, or you spend your entire life yelling at rocks. Fortunately, the British chose the former. Rivers played their part as well. Unlike massive continental waterways, British rivers were short and fast, more useful for powering mills than transporting armies. This meant that Britain didn't develop massive land-based networks like France or Germany. Instead, the sea became its highway, its front yard, its backyard, its mood setter, its escape route, its therapist. When your main transportation system is water, you inevitably become very comfortable with long distances, strong winds, and questionable navigation decisions. Over time, this maritime dependence encouraged a worldview built around movement. Other countries expanded outward by marching. Britain expanded by sailing. And to sail far, you need a mindset that embraces risk, improvisation, and the occasional existential crisis in the middle of a storm. These early experiences planted the seeds of a culture unusually willing to leave home, explore unfamiliar coasts, and make diplomatic introductions that sometimes sounded like, "Nice land you have here. It'll look great next to ours." By the time Britain entered the early modern period, the recipe for empire was already written in its geography. An island that required defence, weather that encouraged leaving, seas that demanded navigation, and neighbours that encouraged overthinking. Empires are often built from grand visions, powerful leaders, or exotic resources. But Britain's, it began with dampness, distance, and an overwhelming sense of, we should probably go somewhere else. Because when you can't expand inward, you stare at the sea and start naming it, and eventually you start sailing across it to see how many things you can name before someone tells you to stop. Before Britain could rule a global empire, it had to answer a simple question. How do you leave an island without drowning? And from that question emerged the real protagonist of British expansion. Not kings, not generals, but ships. Wooden, creaking, stubborn ships built by people who looked at the ocean and said, "Yes, this giant blue danger looks manageable." England's relationship with the sea shifted dramatically between the medieval period and the dawn of the empire. At first, English ships were closer to large floating baskets, useful for fishing, not ideal for global ambition. But ambition has a way of dragging technology behind it, and soon craftsmen across coastal towns had only one job: build something that won't sink immediately. Shipbuilding, once just a trade, became a national obsession. Towns like Plymouth, Portsmouth, and Deptford transformed into massive construction zones where entire forests disappeared into hulls. If a tree grew tall enough, wide enough, or even remotely straight, it was destined to become part of a ship. England didn't just use timber, it inhaled it. Entire regions were stripped of oak to feed the dream of becoming a maritime power. There were probably squirrels who went to sleep in a tree and woke up in the hull of a frigate halfway to Barbados. But these weren't ordinary ships. England began developing vessels that were lighter, faster, and easier to manoeuvre. The early cog ships gave way to caravels, galleons, and eventually sleek warships, designed to dart across the sea like wooden arrows. English shipbuilders became famous for innovation, not because they were visionaries, but because necessity forced their creativity. When you're surrounded by potential invaders and potential riches, you either build better ships or spend your entire life apologizing to the wind. This transformation wasn't only about wood, it was about courage, or more accurately, a national willingness to do reckless things near water. English sailors were trained in an environment where waves, storms, and unpredictable tides were normal. If you survived the English Channel in winter, you could survive anything. It was the world's harshest maritime boot camp, and thousands of future captains were shaped by the daily challenge of try not to sink today. Navigation improved too. Europe was buzzing with new ideas about latitude, longitude, sort of compasses and star charts. England took these tools and wrapped them in a culture of daring experimentation. While some nations waited for perfect weather, English captains looked at storm clouds and thought, "Seems fine." This mix of skill and stubbornness allowed them to attempt journeys others hesitated to take. A critical part of maritime success was the development of coastal communities that fed the seafaring economy. Fishermen became sailors, sailors became explorers, explorers became problem makers, and problem solvers across oceans. Entire towns turned their faces toward the water, living by the tides, the seasons, and the sudden decision of someone in London to send them halfway around the world. If there had been a national questionnaire asking, Would you like to risk your life for king and country by crossing an unforgiving ocean? The likely answer would have been, how much rum is involved? Maritime training, while not formalised, was unforgivingly effective. Young boys learned to climb rigging in storms, tie knots that actually mattered, and recognise the subtle difference between "we might survive" and "we definitely won't." Life on board required resilience, cramped spaces, questionable food, and weather patterns that seemed personally offended by humanity. And yet, the sea produced some of the toughest crews in Europe, men conditioned to handle anything from hostile ships to mutinous rats. England's growing naval culture also produced something new, the idea that ships were not just tools but extensions of national identity. To build a ship was to build a symbol, to sail a ship was to announce presence, to fire a ship's cannons was to declare that destiny had arrived and was very loud. As vessels multiplied, so did a sense of maritime destiny, the belief that if something floated, it had a divine mission to carry English hopes across the world. If the ship floats, its destiny became less a joke and more a guiding principle. But ships alone weren't enough. You needed people who knew how to command them. Enter the captains, the complicated, often terrifying individuals whose confidence kept crews alive. Some were scientific, charting coastlines and recording stars. Others were chaotic forces of nature who navigated by instinct, luck, and the ability to shout loudly during crises. What united them was nerve. To lead a ship required a cocktail of discipline, ego, and the willingness to pretend everything was fine, when it obviously wasn't. By the 16th century, England was no longer a country that merely watched the sea. It was a country that launched itself across it. Shipbuilding expanded into a vast industry, backed by investment, royal encouragement, and a national sense of possibility. Mariners returned with rumours of vast lands, new goods, and oceans that continued beyond comprehension. Each voyage brought back stories that fueled the next. Stories of places where the trees grew differently, the people lived uniquely, and the weather wasn't quite as insulting as back home. Thus, England became the nation that solved problems by sailing at them. Want spices? Sail. Want silver? Sail. Want to annoy Spain? Absolutely sail. The ship became the British equivalent of a multi-purpose tool. Exploration, trade, diplomacy, warfare, and occasionally piracy, all performed with the same wooden vessel. This maritime culture didn't create the empire on its own, but it made empire possible, without ships, fast ones, sturdy ones, too many to count ones. The grand story of British expansion could not have begun. The empire grew not because England wanted the world, but because its ships made the world reachable. And once a nation builds enough ships, it becomes very difficult to resist the temptation to use them. Long before the British Empire was something you could point to on a map, or brag about awkwardly at royal dinner parties, it began as something much less impressive, a business venture, not a glorious national mission, not a grand strategy, not even a well-organised plan. No, the earliest spark of empire came from merchants who wanted money, monarchs who wanted taxes, and everyone agreeing that sailing somewhere far away to sell things sounded like a perfectly reasonable idea. In other words, the British Empire began as a side hustle. If the last part highlighted the ships, this one introduces the people who paid for them, private traders who had enough ambition to span oceans and enough optimism to ignore the part where they could die horribly along the way. England's merchants were not knights, nobles, or warriors. They were business people who treated geography like a marketplace and risk like a minor inconvenience. Their logic was beautifully simple. If we buy cheap over there and sell expensive over here, that's profit. And if the ocean tries to kill us, we'll cross that wave when we come to it. These merchants weren't just buying and selling goods. They were gradually weaving an economic net that stretched well beyond England's damp shores. Towns like Bristol, London and Hull became buzzing centres of trade, where warehouses overflowed with wines, wool, spices, dyes and items whose origins were sometimes unclear and whose legality was even less clear. The early trade system was a blend of innovation, improvisation, and the constant whisper, "Please don't let the customs officer look too closely." To understand this era, imagine a world where international business trips required months at sea, uncertain maps, suspiciously hungry crews, and the occasional pirate who treated ships as floating donation boxes. Yet merchants kept going because the financial rewards were enormous. Spices from the east, sugar from the Caribbean, furs from the north, metals from Africa, everything found its way into English ports. Each new good brought new income, and each new income attracted more merchants, eager to join the game. Unlike monarchs, who were busy ruling, feuding, or mismanaging domestic issues, merchants had flexibility. They didn't need permission to dream globally. They simply needed investors willing to gamble, and gamble they did. Investment pools formed among wealthy families who placed bets on captains and voyages like high-stakes maritime casinos. If the ship returned full, everyone profited. If it didn't return at all, well, that was unfortunate. On to the next one. This system created the foundations of early capitalism. Joint stock companies, financial risk-sharing, insurance schemes, and an economic culture built on speculation. The merchants behaved like entrepreneurs centuries before the word existed. They took risks monarchs couldn't justify and pursued opportunities monarchs couldn't see. Monarchs might have worn crowns, but merchants wore the future. The most influential innovation was the joint stock company, a brilliant concept that essentially said, let's all lose money together, or win money together, instead of just one unlucky person losing everything. This financial invention allowed massive voyages to be funded by groups of investors. No single loss would ruin anyone, and no single success would make anyone unbearable at parties. It democratized risk, multiplied capital, and opened doors to ventures larger than any individual could afford. These companies soon became powerhouses. Before the monarchy dreamed of empire, merchants were already building networks of influence overseas, not controlling lands but controlling markets. They negotiated with foreign leaders, established trading posts, built warehouses in distant ports, and sometimes hired their own armed guards. Their authority grew not from government orders but from economic leverage. Trade relationships, and the profits attached to them, altered the way England saw the world. The planet stopped being a mysterious series of unknown coasts and became a potential spreadsheet. Distance wasn't a barrier, it was an investment, and every successful voyage whispered the same idea into England's collective ear. If private traders can pull this off, imagine what a nation could do. But merchants weren't satisfied with simple trade. They wanted exclusivity, stability, protection, and occasionally the ability to threaten someone who was interfering with their profits. This is where the government began to take notice, not because of exploration, but because of revenue. Monarchs realized that merchants were generating serious wealth, and nothing captures royal attention faster than taxable money floating into someone else's pockets. So began the partnership, sometimes friendly, often tense, between merchants and monarchs. Monarchs granted charters that gave companies exclusive rights to certain regions. In exchange, monarchs collected fees, taxes, and political loyalty. Merchants gained security, monarchs gained income, and both gained the illusion that this was all perfectly normal and not the beginning of something enormous. These early trading companies weren't just businesses. They were proto-empires, armed, wealthy, influential, and increasingly ambitious. While the Crown was busy dealing with domestic politics, merchants were already establishing English presence across oceans. They mapped coastlines, forged alliances, and set up permanent outposts with an efficiency that governments would eventually envy. And as merchants expanded their reach, something subtle but powerful happened. Global thinking became an English habit. No longer was the world a distant mystery. It was a market full of possibilities. private traders became the empire's unintentional architects. They built the connections, developed the routes, and created the expectations that England should play on a global stage. By the time England officially embraced empire, the groundwork was already laid. Merchants had built the routes, the relationships, the financial logic, and the daring mindset required for expansion. They were the empire's quiet founders, the ones who saw the world not as a battlefield, but as a business opportunity. And so, in the beginning, before the crowns, the flags, the maps with dramatic shading, there were simply merchants with big dreams, shaky ledgers, and a belief that anything worth doing was worth doing across an ocean. Because empire didn't begin with monarchs. It began with a side hustle, one that accidentally got out of hand. The British Empire may have been shaped by kings and parliaments, but one of its greatest engines wasn't a government at all. It was a company, not a royal institution, not a state department, just a corporation with shareholders, quarterly concerns, and an ambition level that can best be described as concerning. The East India Company began like any other commercial venture, merchants pooling money to buy exotic goods, and somehow, through an extraordinary blend of audacity, luck, and catastrophic oversight, it evolved into something unprecedented. A corporation that ruled millions of people, commanded armies, minted currency, and negotiated treaties. In other words, imagine a world where Amazon delivers spices, negotiates diplomatic alliances, and occasionally conquers a province. That's the general vibe. The East India Company was founded in 1600 with a royal charter giving it the right to trade in the East Indies. A very simple contract, really. The sort of document everyone assumed would result in some polite commerce, maybe a few spiced cargoes, and then everyone would go home satisfied. But the company was run by men who saw rules not as boundaries, but as suggested guidelines. And once you give ambitious traders permission to explore a region they barely understand, you're basically inviting chaos with a business logo. Their first mission wasn't glamorous. The company sent ships to the Spice Islands, only to discover that the Dutch were already there, very established, and aggressively protective of nutmeg. The English retreated from that arena with the maritime equivalent of a bruised ego, which drove them to search elsewhere for opportunity. This led them to India, a place of immense wealth, ancient civilizations, established empires, and far more potential than anyone in London could have imagined. At first, the company's approach was humble. They requested permission from Indian rulers to establish small trading posts along the coast. These posts, factories as they were called, were not factories in the modern sense, but fortified warehouses. And here's where the story begins to twist. Once you build a warehouse with cannons, you've already taken your first step toward empire building. Fortifications imply danger, cannons imply ambition, and armed warehouses imply you're prepared to win an argument using more than negotiation. The company quickly learned that trade in India wasn't simply about buying goods. It was about navigating complex political landscapes, forming alliances, and defending their interests in a region filled with powerful kingdoms. Companies today complain about market competition. The East India Company complained about rival states, armed competitors, and entire empires who occasionally disagreed with their profit margins. The turning point came as the Mughal Empire weakened in the 18th century. The company, always alert to opportunity, realized that political instability created openings, not for trade, but for influence. Merchants became power brokers, clerks became diplomats, soldiers on payroll became de facto armies. Soon the company wasn't just participating in Indian politics, it was shaping them, funding factions and choosing winners. When your business strategy includes dethroning rulers, you've officially crossed the line from corporation to empire light. And then came 1757, the Battle of Plassey. A stunning moment when a private company defeated a regional Indian ruler, not through sheer military strength, but through alliances, bribery, and tactics best described as creative negotiation. Victory at Plassey granted the company control of Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions on earth. Overnight, they transformed from traders to tax collectors who controlled land, revenue, and lives. That's when the mask fell. The company was no longer acting like a business. It was behaving like a state. Their army grew, not a militia, not a guard force, but a massive professional military, one of the largest standing armies in the world. It was staffed mostly by Indian soldiers, sepoys, led by British officers, and paid for by Indian tax revenue. This was the ultimate corporate hack: rule a region using the region's own resources while funneling wealth back to shareholders thousands of miles away. It was both a logistical miracle and an ethical disaster. The company minted coins, issued laws, negotiated treaties, built roads and fortresses, fought wars against Indian kingdoms, European rivals and insurgents. Corporate meetings in London discussed profit margins, while field generals in India discussed troop movements. Imagine being a clerk in London trying to balance the books while reading reports about conquering a province. It was bureaucratic madness dressed as commercial efficiency. But power breeds problems. Corruption exploded. Company officials became notorious for extravagant wealth and political manipulation. Bengal's economy suffered devastating famine under mismanagement. Public outrage grew in both India and Britain. Parliament stepped in, trying to regulate the company with varying degrees of success. The company complied only when absolutely necessary, and even then, reluctantly, like a teenager being asked to clean their room. The breaking point arrived with the 1857 rebellion, a massive uprising fueled by anger, cultural tensions, economic exploitation, and mistrust. The company's armies fought fiercely, but the rebellion shattered any illusion that a corporation could responsibly govern a subcontinent. In 1858, the British government stepped in, officially dissolving the company's rule and taking direct control of India. And so, the East India Company, which began as a modest trading venture, ended as a cautionary tale of corporate overreach on a staggering scale. No company before or since has wielded so much military, political and economic power. It was quite literally Amazon with muskets, but far more dangerous. The company didn't build the British Empire alone, but it created its spine. It proved that global control was possible. It normalized overseas rule. It assembled the wealth, structures and strategies that Britain later adopted. The empire was shaped by monarchs and governments, yes, but the blueprint was drawn by businessmen who accidentally conquered too much. Because sometimes the biggest empires don't start with kings. They start with invoices, ledgers, and a company policy that gets wildly out of hand. When people imagine the dawn of the British Empire, they often picture a nation with maps, strategies, naval timetables, and a confident finger pointing across the ocean saying, "We shall claim that." The truth? The earliest colonies were less master plan and more group project where everyone forgot the instructions. There was no imperial blueprint, no long-term vision, just scattered attempts by merchants, adventurers, dreamers, and the occasional desperate aristocrat hoping that if he sailed far enough, he'd stop being in debt. The first British colonies were experiments in the purest sense, improvised, chaotic, and driven by guesswork disguised as leadership. If these early settlers had written a handbook, it would have been titled How to Build a Civilization Using Hope and Whatever You Can Carry. The people involved weren't trained colonizers. They were volunteers who misunderstood the assignment. Take Jamestown, the poster child of English colonial planning. On paper, it looked promising. Fertile land, defensible position, new opportunities. In practice, it was a mosquito-infested marsh chosen by gentlemen who didn't realise they'd need to do physical labour. They arrived expecting fortune and found mud, hunger, and approximately 1 million inconvenient insects. Some settlers spent more time searching for gold than planting crops, a decision history has politely labelled an extremely poor choice. This wasn't unique. Early British colonies were often founded by people who believed that survival was something that happened naturally, like sunrise. They underestimated how difficult it would be to build shelter, find food, and avoid being immediately claimed by the local environment. Every colonial venture contained at least one moment where someone surely asked, "Should we have read more about this before sailing?" And yet, behind all the chaos was something very human, an earnest desire for opportunity. England's social structure left little room for advancement unless you were born into the right family. For many, the colonies represented a reset button, a place where you could reinvent yourself, fail spectacularly, and still claim you were doing better than your cousin back home. But opportunity without preparation is basically a survival challenge, and the early colonists were suddenly confronted with problems they had never imagined, from unfamiliar climates to crops that refused to cooperate with English optimism. Supplies were always a problem. Colonies often underestimated how much food they'd need, how long resupply ships would take, or how fast settlers could burn through what they'd brought. Ships arrived late, storms destroyed stores, and rats developed a mysterious appetite for anything vaguely edible. Crop failures were common, often because colonists planted the wrong things in the wrong soil at the wrong time. 3 errors that do not cancel each other out. Relationships with indigenous peoples varied widely, often depending on who happened to be in charge on a given day. Some leaders sought alliances, others arrived with the communication skills of a brick and immediately created conflict. Many colonists didn't understand local customs or political landscapes, and this ignorance frequently led to misunderstandings that could turn dangerous. The British didn't yet see themselves as rulers. They were simply guests who overstayed their welcome with impressive consistency. Governance was another improvisation. Colonial charters offered vague instructions like establish order, but rarely specified how. Settlers created councils, assemblies, or ad hoc governments where decisions were debated loudly and solved slowly. Power struggles erupted because everyone believed they were qualified to lead, despite evidence to the contrary. Some colonies dissolved into chaos, others survived by sheer stubbornness. A few thrived because local conditions happened to be more forgiving. Economically, colonies rarely knew what they were supposed to produce. Investors back in England imagined steady profits but gave little guidance. Some colonies tried growing everything from grapes to silk, usually with tragic results. Others focused on exporting goods that were more optimistic than useful. It took years, sometimes decades, for each colony to figure out what it was actually good at. Religious motives added to the confusion. Some colonies were built by groups fleeing persecution, others by groups hoping to build idealized societies. These visions rarely matched reality. Imagine trying to build a perfect spiritual community while everyone around you is starving, cold, and questioning whether mosquitoes can be converted. Despite the messiness, these early colonial experiments taught England valuable lessons, none of them intentional. They showed the importance of stable leadership, reliable supply lines, local alliances, and realistic expectations. They demonstrated that survival was not guaranteed, and that success required adaptation rather than blind optimism. They revealed that colonization was complex, not a matter of planting a flag and declaring victory, but a difficult, often fragile process shaped by geography, culture, and luck. Over time, the colonies that endured did so because they learned to adapt. They shifted from survival panic to structured development, building roads, organizing labor, establishing trade networks, and creating legal systems. These changes happened gradually, as communities discovered what worked and what definitely did not. From a distance, England looked increasingly like a nation with overseas holdings. Up close, it was a patchwork of trial and error experiments held together by determination, improvisation, and the occasional miracle. The irony is that these shaky beginnings created the foundation for something much larger. By surviving their own mistakes, early colonies proved that English settlement overseas was possible. Not efficient, not predictable, but possible. And possibility is all an empire needs to get started. Because in the beginning, Nobody knew what they were doing. They just did it confidently, wrote hopeful letters home, and prayed the next ship brought food, reinforcements, and someone who actually knew how to farm. If the early British Empire had a sweet tooth, it paid for that sweetness with one of the darkest, most destructive systems in human history. Sugar, the innocent-looking crystals that now sit quietly in kitchen jars, was once the engine of empire, the magnet of global trade, and the justification for brutality on a scale that made even contemporary observers uncomfortable. The rise of sugar transformed the Atlantic world, inflated British wealth, and left moral stains that no amount of economic success could hide. To understand the British Empire without acknowledging sugar is like trying to bake a cake without flour. It simply doesn't work. Sugar didn't just flavour tea, it flavoured policy, profit, expansion, and a web of exploitation that stretched across continents. The Caribbean became Britain's sugar bowl, a region whose climate made it ideal for cultivating cane. But sugar cane was not a polite crop. It wasn't a gentle, friendly plant. It demanded land, labour, and relentless work. The process from planting to harvesting to boiling required astonishing manpower. Manpower that the empire solved not by hiring workers, but by enslaving them. And this is where the spreadsheets diverged from reality. On paper, plantations looked like efficient profit machines, columns of imports, exports, yields, and revenues. In practice, they were brutal, punishing labour camps built on human suffering. Plantation owners in Britain loved their tidy account books. They loved even more the idea that sugar essentially grew money. The islands produced staggering wealth that poured into ports like Bristol, Liverpool, and London. Sugar profits built mansions, funded political careers, and financed new ships that would expand the empire further. It is no exaggeration to say that sugar money helped Britain climb into global power status. But the labour that made sugar profitable came from the transatlantic slave trade, a system so vast and violent that its scale still challenges comprehension. Ships packed human beings like cargo, transported them across the Atlantic under horrific conditions, and sold them at Caribbean markets to work in fields that were, by design, places of exhaustion and death. Enslaved people were treated as replaceable units on a balance sheet, not as human beings. Plantation owners measured success in tons of sugar, not the cost in human lives. The brutality was systematic. Sugar cane had to be cut quickly and continuously. No breaks, no pauses, because once it ripened, delays meant financial loss. This meant enslaved labourers worked from dawn to dusk, then dusk to dawn during harvest seasons. The mills were dangerous, the fields were unforgiving, the discipline was violent, mortality rates were horrifying, so plantation owners simply bought more enslaved people rather than improve conditions. The replacement rate in the Caribbean was so high that the population could not sustain itself, which meant constant shipments of new captives. In other words, the system was designed to kill. Meanwhile, back in Britain, consumers stirred sugar into tea and congratulated themselves on their refined taste. They did not ask why sugar was suddenly affordable. They did not ask why Caribbean plantations produced far more wealth than seemed reasonable. They certainly did not ask about the cost of that sweetness. For many, ignorance was comfort. For others, it was denial. And for a wealthy elite, it was deliberate silence. Even members of Parliament with plantations on colonial islands could defend the necessity of the slave system while enjoying profits that made their political careers possible. Sugar wealth fueled more than individual fortunes. It funded industries. Shipbuilding expanded to accommodate the triangular trade. Banks grew to handle complicated credit and investment structures. Insurance companies emerged, including some that literally insured human beings as cargo, entire British. Cities were economically reshaped by the profits flowing from the Caribbean. Museums, universities, and cultural institutions received endowments funded directly or indirectly by sugar slavery. The empire's infrastructure, ports, warehouses, financial networks, grew stronger through a system that depended on people having no freedom at all. Yet even in the 18th century, there were people who recognised the contradiction. Writers, religious groups, and ordinary citizens began questioning the morality of a nation that called itself civilized while profiting from barbaric systems. Abolitionist movements emerged, slowly at first, then more forcefully. They exposed what the spreadsheets hid, the cruelty behind the columns. Their pamphlets, petitions and speeches forced Britain to confront questions it had long avoided. But change was slow, contested, and often resisted by those whose wealth depended on sugar. The contradictions grew sharper as Britain became more industrialised and proud of its progress. How could a nation invent new technologies, champion Enlightenment ideals, and still rely on a system based on forced labour? How could politicians praise liberty while profiting from slavery? How could a society that valued order ignore the disorder it inflicted on millions of lives? These were not abstract questions, they were national fractures. Even after slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s, the legacy of sugar did not disappear. Plantation economies adapted by exploiting indentured labourers from India and China, creating new forms of coercion. The economic structures built on slavery remained intact. Sugar had reshaped colonial societies, entrenched racial hierarchies, and created long-term disparities that would ripple far beyond the 19th century. And for Britain, sugar wealth had already done what it needed to do: fuel expansion, strengthen naval power, and provide the financial muscle that made future imperial ambitions feasible. Sugar had been the empire's invisible scaffolding. Without it, Britain's rise would have been far slower and far weaker. So yes, the spreadsheets were tidy, they were elegant, they were profitable. But the reality behind them was devastating. The empire grew on sweetness, but its foundations were bitterly human. If the British Empire had a single superpower, an ability that turned a damp island into a global empire, it wasn't its kings, its wealth, or its political finesse. It was the navy. A navy so massive, so relentless, and so obsessively maintained that it became the empire's defining feature. Britain didn't rule the world because it had the biggest army. It ruled because it could float more wood, iron and gunpowder across the oceans than anyone else. When Britain argued, it argued with ships. To understand why naval dominance mattered so much, imagine the world in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, not as a collection of land borders but as a web of oceans. The sea wasn't a barrier, it was the highway system of global power. Whoever controlled it controlled trade, communication, military movement, and the ability to show up uninvited anywhere on the planet. Armies could win wars, navies could win worlds. Britain learned this early. As an island, it didn't have the luxury of relying on giant land forces like France, Prussia, or Russia. Armies were expensive, slow, and limited by terrain. But navies were flexible. They could strike anywhere, withdraw anywhere, and appear on the horizon like a surprise bill you forgot to pay. And since Britain's economy, colonies, and strategic interests all depended on overseas movement, the navy became not just a branch of the military, but the empire's backbone. From the 1600s onward, Britain poured money into shipbuilding the way modern governments pour money into technology. Constantly, aggressively, and occasionally with a blank cheque. Dockyards expanded into industrial monsters. Timber was harvested from across Europe and North America. Entire trades existed just to supply the navy. Rope makers, sail makers, carpenters, metal workers, tar boilers, cannon specialists, and thousands more. Ports like Portsmouth, Chatham and Plymouth weren't just cities. They were naval ecosystems. The scale of this naval world was staggering. A single first-rate ship of the line required thousands of trees, miles of rope, and a crew of hundreds. Multiply that by dozens of ships, then hundreds, and you begin to see why other nations found Britain's naval dedication alarming. When someone builds this many ships, it's never just for decoration. Control of the seas meant control of trade, and trade meant money. British merchants shipped goods to every corner of the globe. British ships carried spices, textiles, tea, silver, weapons, and manufactured goods. As long as Britain protected the ocean routes, its economic machine kept spinning. And if someone threatened those routes, the Navy arrived with cannons and a highly persuasive attitude. One of Britain's greatest naval strengths was organisation. The Royal Navy wasn't just a fleet, it was an institution with discipline, training, and an almost fanatical commitment to professionalism. Officers learned navigation, mathematics, seamanship, and tactics. Sailors spent years mastering rigging, signalling, and shipboard life. The hierarchy was steep, the discipline strict, and the expectations brutal, but the results were undeniable. The Royal Navy could outmaneuver, outshoot, and outendure its rivals. Then there was the doctrine, blockade warfare. Britain realised early that it didn't need to defeat enemy armies to win wars, it just needed to starve their economies. A British blockade could strangle trade, bankrupt treasuries, and create crises without firing a single shot. This strategy was used against Spain, France, the Netherlands, and eventually Napoleonic Europe. When Britain blockaded you, it wasn't an inconvenience, it was a national emergency. Naval dominance also allowed Britain to choose the timing and place of its conflicts. The Empire didn't need to defend massive land borders. Instead, it used the navy as a shield and sword simultaneously. Ships patrolled colonies, escorted merchant fleets, attacked enemy ports, and delivered troops wherever needed. Britain could reinforce India, secure Canada, intervene in Africa, or strike at Caribbean islands, all without crossing a single continental border. But perhaps the most defining moment for British naval supremacy came in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar, where Admiral Nelson cemented his place in history and Britain eliminated the threat of French naval power. After Trafalgar, Britain had no serious naval rivals. It was the ocean's sole landlord, and every ship that sailed did so with British permission, at least in spirit. This era, often called Pax Britannica, wasn't peaceful because nations suddenly liked each other. It was peaceful because Britain had such overwhelming naval authority that challenging it felt like arguing with a thunderstorm. The Navy didn't just project force, it projected image. British sailors became global symbols, sometimes feared, sometimes admired, often gossiped about. Tales of naval battles, storms survived, and oceans crossed turned sailors into folk heroes. Meanwhile, British ships became floating billboards of empire, announcing Britain's presence in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and everywhere in between. Technological change didn't slow the Navy's dominance, it accelerated it. When steam replaced sail, Britain adapted. When iron replaced wood, Britain adapted faster. The Empire's industrial power ensured that it built the best ships, armed them with the best weapons, and crewed them with some of the most experienced sailors on Earth. The Navy was no longer just a military force, it was a symbol of modernity, industry, and national pride. Naval dominance shaped British culture too. Songs, literature, and traditions celebrated maritime life. Coastal towns revolved around naval rhythms. Even government policy was structured around protecting the seas. Britain saw itself not as a land nation with a navy, but as a naval nation with land attached. And through all of this, one truth remained constant. If you control the water, you control the arguments. Britain controlled the water. Therefore, Britain won the arguments. The Navy didn't just protect the Empire, it was the Empire, the force that held it together, expanded it, defended it, and eventually defined it. There is a popular myth that empires expand only because their leaders sit in rooms lit by dramatic candles and whisper, "We shall conquer that next." The British Empire, however, often expanded the same way someone cleans a messy room, by getting distracted, bumping into things, and accumulating far more than intended. Nowhere is this clearer than in the series of European wars that unintentionally turned Britain into a global landlord. These wars weren't about empire, they were about grudges, old rivalries, continental drama, complaints carried across borders for generations. But because European powers had planted flags all over the world, fighting in Europe meant fighting in the Caribbean, India, Africa, and the Americas. Colonies became extensions of the battlefield, prizes to be taken, traded, negotiated, or accidentally inherited at the end of a treaty. Many British politicians insisted they were fighting for balance of power in Europe, and perhaps they were. But every time a war ended, Britain looked around and realised it somehow owned more coastline, ports and outposts than before, as if war were a strange carnival game where the prize was a new colony. Britain didn't always plan to win territory, but victory delivered it anyway. The War of Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, is a prime example. Europe was tearing itself, apart over who should sit on the Spanish throne. Britain's main goal: prevent France from grabbing too much power. The result? Britain walked away with Gibraltar, which it still holds today, Minorca, briefly, and a set of trade privileges that boosted its influence in the Atlantic. It fought to stop France, but left with a Mediterranean foothold that would become a naval cornerstone. Not bad for a war over someone else's succession drama. Then came the War of Jenkins' Ear, a conflict whose origin story is so absurd it feels fictional. A British captain claimed a Spanish officer sliced off his ear, and Parliament, ever composed and reasonable, eventually used this as a justification for large-scale warfare in the Caribbean. The war merged into the larger War of Austrian Succession, and while it didn't produce enormous territorial gains, it revealed something important. Britain would fight over commerce, over ships, over insults, and over ears. Apparently every conflict taught Britain how to move troops, coordinate fleets, and seize enemy colonies, all valuable practice for later expansions. But nothing changed Britain's global map more dramatically than the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, a conflict so widespread that some historians affectionately call it World War Zero. France and Britain, long-standing rivals with remarkably similar imperial appetites, collided across the globe. Battles erupted in Europe, India, the Caribbean, West Africa, and North America. The war's geographic range was so massive that soldiers often had no idea where the main front actually was. This war reshaped the British Empire more than any other. In North America, the British defeated the French, seizing control of Canada and edging France out of its colonial dominance there. In the Caribbean, Britain captured profitable islands and briefly lost others. In India, the company's forces, backed by the British state, undermined French influence, setting the stage for British supremacy on the subcontinent. When the Treaty of Paris 1763 was signed, Britain didn't just gain land, it gained momentum. Its empire was suddenly vast, varied, and difficult to ignore. The irony: Britain entered the war to contain French power in Europe, not to acquire half of North America. But winning the war came with a monumental accidental bonus: vast new territories that needed to be governed, defended, taxed, and absorbed. Empire at this point wasn't just a choice, it was an administrative burden with continental dimensions. Yet war-driven expansion had a hidden cost. Each victory created new tensions, responsibilities, and expenses. After the 7 Years' War, Britain faced enormous debt. Maintaining troops in North America was costly, so Parliament, in a move that would go down in the history of questionable decisions, attempted to tax the American colonies to cover the bill. One thing led to another: tea, protests, yelling, declarations, and soon Britain was fighting a war it absolutely did not win. The American Revolution revealed a flaw in the war's pay-for-empire strategy. Sometimes the bill arrives late and loudly. Still, even setbacks didn't stop Britain's habit of acquiring territory during European conflicts. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803-1815, were the most dramatic illustration. Britain's main priority was stopping Napoleon from taking over the continent. Meanwhile, its navy politely, or not so politely, relieved France, the Netherlands and Spain of their overseas colonies whenever possible. As European powers fell under French control, Britain took their colonies for safekeeping, a clever diplomatic way of saying, we'll just hold on to this indefinitely. By the time Napoleon was defeated, Britain had accumulated strategic islands, trading hubs, and territories across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Cape Colony, Ceylon, Trinidad, Heligoland, Mauritius, Malta. These weren't mere trophies. They were nodes in a growing global network, places where the Royal Navy could refuel, merchants could operate, and administrators could extend British influence. Europe's wars became the empire's expansion engine. Britain didn't always start the wars, but it often finished them wealthier. Territory gained in treaties was like interest added to Britain's imperial account. Meanwhile, its rivals, France, Spain, the Netherlands, saw their empires shrink or fragment as they battled crises at home. But beneath the victories lay a growing contradiction. Britain preached stability while expanding through conflict. It claimed to defend freedom while collecting colonies. It insisted it fought for balance in Europe, yet it unbalanced the world outside it. These tensions would deepen in later centuries, especially as colonized peoples resisted foreign rule. Still, in the era of musket diplomacy and global naval warfare, Britain perfected the art of winning wars and accidentally acquiring continents. It wasn't always intentional, it wasn't always graceful, but it was effective. Because in the strange mathematics of empire, a European war might begin over a throne, a treaty, or even an ear, and end with Britain adding new lands to its map, as if victory came with free real estate. If the British Empire had a secret weapon, it wasn't gunpowder, ships, or even money. It was something far more terrifying. Paperwork, stamps, ledgers, regulations, reports, committees, dossiers, entire forests sacrificed so that Britain could extend its influence one form at a time. Other empires conquered with swords, Britain conquered with filing cabinets. Administrators, often pale, bespectacled and allergic to sunlight, became the empire's real engine. They were the people who turned chaotic geography into manageable districts, vast populations into census figures, and cultural complexity into neat tables that could be shipped back to London. These men weren't warriors, but they wielded pens with the confidence of people who believed ink had divine authority. In many parts of the empire, the British didn't rule by sheer force. They ruled because they wrote things down before anyone else had the chance. The British love of paperwork had deep roots. At home, the monarchy had long been constrained by parliamentary oversight, common law, and an evolving belief that government worked best when it argued with itself in writing. This bureaucratic mindset travelled overseas, where it metastasized into a sprawling administrative machine. Once Britain acquired territory, the first question wasn't, how do we defend this? But who's bringing the ledgers? A region wasn't considered fully conquered until someone had filed the appropriate report. Across the empire, administrators created systems of governance that standardized how everything should work, from taxation to land rights to the proper form of a complaint letter. They drafted legal codes, translated them, sometimes badly, and expected everyone to follow them. In some colonies, British laws replaced local customs. In others, they layered themselves on top of existing practices like a complex, legally binding lasagna. Bureaucracy became the empire's most consistent export, rivaled only by tea. Local subjects soon discovered that British rule was less about the looming presence of red-coated soldiers and more about the looming presence of stern clerks who explained, "Your form is incorrect. Please fill out the other one." The British Empire's great trick was convincing millions of people that their lives needed to be documented before they could proceed. A simple transaction, buying land, reporting a crime, registering livestock, suddenly required signatures, seals, witnesses, and sometimes the approval of a distant official who had never met you and possibly didn't know your town existed. It wasn't just paperwork for paperwork's sake. Bureaucracy allowed a small number of British officials to control vast populations with remarkable efficiency. Instead of policing millions of people directly, They created systems that encouraged or forced locals to police themselves. Courts, councils, tax offices, permit registries, and civil service positions that required obedience to the administrative structure. British power didn't rely solely on coercion, it relied on process. This administrative model was especially powerful in places like India, where the sheer size and diversity of the population meant Britain needed more than soldiers. So they built a civil service so rigorous and competitive that passing its exams became a heroic achievement. These exams tested everything from history to philosophy to the ability to endure months of reading without crying. Successful candidates became the empire's elite bureaucrats, men who travelled thousands of miles to manage districts, oversee revenue, maintain order, and write reports so detailed they might include the number of goats a village sneezed at last Thursday. And oh, the reports. British administrators loved them. They wrote about weather, crops, trade, disease, local disputes, local festivals, and anything else that could be converted into data. If an event happened, someone documented it. If it didn't happen, someone documented why. Reports were copied, sent to supervisors, archived, referenced in committees, debated in Parliament, and eventually stored in dusty rooms where they would sit for a century until a modern historian discovered them and said, "Why is this 600-page file about barley yields?" Paperwork created an air of inevitability. To govern something is to define it, and to define it is to write it down. Colonial borders, many of which still exist today, were drawn not by cultural logic but by men with rulers and inkwells. Laws about land were created without understanding local traditions. Tax categories were invented by people fascinated by classification. Bureaucracy shaped political realities simply by declaring them on paper. This administrative dominance could be absurd. Regions were reorganized because an official preferred straight lines. Economic policies were drafted using outdated data. Judges enforced codes translated from English into languages that didn't always share the same legal concepts. Entire communities sometimes woke up to learn they had been reclassified and were now expected to follow new rules written thousands of miles away. It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was just the natural consequence of governing through forms. If it exists on paper, it must be true. Yet there was a strange stability to this system. British bureaucracy often functioned better than expected, creating frameworks for courts, education, infrastructure, and administration. People who never supported imperial rule still found themselves relying on the structures it built, simply because they were the only functioning systems available. The empire's bureaucratic skeleton lingered long after the political body dissolved. But the contradictions were impossible to ignore. A nation that preached free trade used paperwork to restrict movement. A nation that celebrated liberty required permits for basic activities. A nation that claimed order sometimes imposed it through administrative confusion. British officials prided themselves on logic, yet they often enforced rules that were baffling in context. Bureaucracy became both the empire's strength and its comic flaw. Efficient in theory, exasperating in practice. Still, Britain's power didn't rest on the charisma of its rulers. It rested on the endurance of its administrators, people who believed the world could be governed through folders, ink, and carefully worded statutes. Because in the British Empire, conquest didn't always arrive wearing a uniform. Sometimes it arrived holding a form and asking you to sign at the bottom. If the British Empire were a video game, the Industrial Revolution was the moment Britain unlocked cheat codes. Before this era, expansion depended on ships, merchants, and improvisation. After the Industrial Revolution, Britain became something else entirely, a nation with mechanical muscle, economic momentum, and factories that roared day and night like metallic beasts demanding constant feeding. Steam didn't just enter the chat, it took over the entire conversation. The story begins with coal. Black, dirty, abundant coal. Britain possessed enormous coal deposits conveniently located near rivers, ports, and growing towns. Coal wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. It turned heat into energy, energy into movement, and movement into global advantage. When other European nations were still debating how to modernise their economies, Britain was already digging up half the countryside to fuel inventions that would reshape the world. If the island was once a damp outpost on Europe's edge, coal turned it into a smokestack rising above the continent. Factories emerged first in textiles, transforming spinning and weaving from household tasks into massive industrial operations. Machines did the work of dozens, sometimes hundreds of labourers, churning out cloth at unprecedented speed. British cotton mills became relentless engines of production, so efficient that global markets couldn't keep up. What once required patient craftsmanship became a blur of mechanical precision. Britain didn't just produce textiles, it flooded the world with them, and every bolt of cloth reinforced its economic influence. Steam power was the revolution's heartbeat. The steam engine turned coal into motion, and motion into capability. Mines used steam to pump water, factories used it to drive machinery, and soon locomotives used it to whisk goods across the island faster than any horse could dream. Railways carved through countryside, connecting ports, mills, towns, and cities with iron pathways that allowed goods to move with astonishing speed. Britain shrank, not physically, but temporally. What used to take days now took hours. What took hours now took minutes. Efficiency became a national obsession. Industrialization didn't just change production, it changed society. Cities swelled as people abandoned rural life for factory jobs. Smoke rose from chimneys like industrial flags. Streets buzzed with workers, carts, engines, and noise. The air was thick with soot and ambition. The industrial city wasn't comfortable, healthy, or quiet, but it was productive, and productivity was the empire's new currency. These changes had profound imperial implications. Factories needed raw materials, vast quantities of them. Cotton, metals, dyes, rubber, timber, grain. Britain couldn't rely solely on its own land. It needed colonial resources, and it needed them constantly. Industrialization didn't just fuel the empire, it demanded it. Colonies supplied the raw materials, and British factories turned those materials into manufactured goods, which were then exported back to colonies and international markets. This global loop was not an accident. It was the industrial economy made visible on the world map. Machines gave Britain speed. Factories gave Britain volume. Railways gave Britain coordination. And steamships. Oh, steamships changed everything. They made long-distance travel faster, more reliable, and less dependent on the unpredictable moods of wind and weather. Naval dominance in the age of sail was impressive. Naval dominance in the age of steam was unstoppable. Britain could now move troops, mail, goods, and officials across oceans with a punctuality that felt almost unnatural compared to previous centuries. Industrialization also reshaped military power. Cannons, rifles, and ammunition were manufactured with precision. Ironclads replaced wooden warships. Telegraph lines allowed instant communication across continents and oceans. The empire became more responsive, more connected, and more capable of projecting power than ever before. When rebellions emerged or conflicts erupted, Britain could respond faster and more forcefully than rival empires. Industrial might translate it directly into imperial control. But the relationship wasn't one-sided. The empire fed industrial growth, and industrial growth deepened imperial dependence. Some colonies became agricultural engines, others mining hubs, others transit points for global shipping. The British economy became an intricate web connecting factory towns in Lancashire to cotton fields in India, copper mines in Africa, and ports in the Caribbean. Each piece depended on the others. Britain didn't just have an empire, it needed one. The Industrial Revolution also worked a cultural transformation. British society became more confident, sometimes excessively so. Advancements in engineering, science and industry, created a sense of superiority that seeped into imperial ideology. If you could build machines that defied nature, conquer distance, and mass-produce goods at world record speed, it became tempting to believe you were destined to lead. Industrial success didn't just fuel imperial expansion, it justified it in the minds of many Victorians. And yet, for all the triumphs of industry, the revolution had darker edges. Cities were overcrowded, factories were dangerous, pollution blanketed skylines in a permanent grey dusk. Children worked long hours, workers inhaled dust, smoke and chemical fumes. Industrial power had a price, and ordinary people paid it. The empire might have celebrated its technological marvels, but inside the factories the conditions were often grim. Machines roared, floors shook, and human exhaustion was treated as an unfortunate but necessary byproduct of progress. Meanwhile, colonised regions felt the effects too. Their economies were reshaped around Britain's industrial needs. Craft traditions collapsed under the weight of cheap imports. Local industries with deep histories buckled against factory-produced competition. This wasn't just economic pressure, it was cultural disruption on a massive scale. Still, the Industrial Revolution transformed Britain into something no other nation could match at the time. A mechanised empire with global reach, economic muscle, and technological momentum. Its factories produced not only goods, but a new kind of power, one built on steam, steel, and the relentless logic of mass production. Because once steam enters the chat, the world doesn't just change, it accelerates. Britain didn't just ride the industrial wave, it became the wave. And the empire grew not only through strategy or luck, but through machines that worked tirelessly, endlessly, and loudly, reshaping the world one revolution at a time. If the British Empire had a centre of gravity, a place that defined its wealth, strategy, and self-image, it wasn't London. It wasn't the Caribbean sugar islands. It wasn't even the vast African territories that arrived later. It was India, a land so large, complex, ancient, and economically vital that it pulled the entire imperial structure into its orbit. Once Britain entrenched itself on the subcontinent, the empire wasn't simply global, it was anchored. India was not just another colony. It was the colony, the crown's prized possession, the imperial jewel, the location that British politicians, generals, merchants and romantics obsessed over with equal intensity. And the strangest part, Britain never intended for India to become its centrepiece. But once it happened, the empire's beating heart was indeed 5,000 miles away. Economically, India was irresistible. The subcontinent was a treasure chest overflowing with resources: cotton, opium, tea, indigo, rice, spices, textiles, and a population large enough to support endless markets and endless labour. For centuries before British arrival, India had been a global manufacturing and trading powerhouse, producing goods admired across continents. When Britain inserted itself into this world, it discovered a system far more developed than anything in Europe. Skilled artisans, vibrant cities, bustling ports. India had been doing international commerce before Britain was even done arguing about feudalism. Once the British East India Company secured control over Bengal in the mid-1700s, the economic logic shifted dramatically. Bengal's wealth, its fertile fields, productive workshops, and dense population gave Britain a financial engine unmatched anywhere else. Taxes collected in India powered company profits. Company profits powered British influence. British influence demanded further control. Soon, British administrators realised that India wasn't just profitable, it was essential. India became the empire's financial stabiliser. Its revenue funded armies stationed across Asia. Its crop supported global trade. Its cotton fed British mills. Its opium funded the balance of trade with China. The subcontinent wasn't merely a colony, it was a gigantic economic circuit breaker. If India faltered, Britain faltered. If India prospered, for British interests at least, The empire's entire system hummed. Strategically, India's location was almost a cosmic gift for an empire obsessed with ocean routes. From India, Britain could monitor the Middle East, protect trade with China, influence Central Asia, and dominate the Indian Ocean, the maritime crossroads of half the world's commerce. Control of India meant control of sea lanes stretching from the Red Sea to Singapore. It meant naval bases, commercial hubs, and the ability to launch or prevent military campaigns across Asia at will. The subcontinent also provided soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them. Indian troops, trained and led by British officers, became one of the empire's most important military assets. These soldiers fought in wars far beyond India's borders, in Africa, in China, in the Middle East, and in countless campaigns where British manpower alone would have been insufficient. India wasn't only the empire's economic anchor, it was its military backbone. Psychologically, India reshaped how Britain viewed itself. After all, ruling a vast, populous, culturally rich civilization gave Britain a sense of grandeur it had never possessed before. India became central to British imperial identity, proof that this small island nation could govern enormous lands and ancient societies. Politicians delivered speeches about India with theatrical pride. Newspapers published glowing descriptions of imperial responsibility. And British elites adopted Indian motifs in fashion, decor, literature, and architecture. Even Queen Victoria declared herself Empress of India, a title designed not to reflect Indian reality, but to boost British ego. The British ruling class became enamoured with the idea that they were custodians of a civilization older than their own, an incredibly convenient belief that allowed them to justify their presence. They convinced themselves they were preserving order, modernising society, and improving administration. The contradictions were staggering. Britain exploited India's resources, dismantled many of its traditional industries, and imposed new legal systems, yet still framed itself as performing a noble duty. Such was the psychological gymnastics of empire. India's scale also forced Britain to develop new forms of governance. The country was too vast, too diverse, too culturally layered to rule with simplistic designs. The British created elaborate administrative networks, reorganised provinces, restructured taxation, built railways, and established centralised systems of law. They weren't doing this out of altruism. They were doing it to make ruling India manageable. Yet these systems became long-lasting, structures that outlived the empire itself. Railways deserve special mention. They were built to move goods, troops, and officials, not to unify India, but they had cultural and political consequences the British never anticipated. Railways connected cities across cultural boundaries, creating links that fostered new forms of communication, identity, and eventually nationalism. It was one of history's great ironies. The empire built India's transportation skeleton to strengthen control, only for the same network to later help accelerate resistance movements. The psychological importance of India ran even deeper. For many British officials, serving in India was the pinnacle of a career. It meant prestige, responsibility, challenge. Memoirs, novels, diaries, and letters from the period describe India with fascination, awe, fear, arrogance, admiration, sometimes all at once. British identity became intertwined with the idea of ruling the subcontinent. When people spoke of the empire's greatness, they weren't thinking of Canada's forests or Australia's deserts. They were thinking of India's teeming cities, ancient temples, and vast landscapes. Yet beneath all this admiration and rhetoric lay a profoundly unequal relationship. Britain relied on India for wealth, labour, and status, but India did not receive equivalent benefits. Famines occurred during colonial rule, sometimes worsened by economic policies that prioritised exports over local needs. Industries that once made India prosperous, textiles, crafts, and manufacturing, declined under the pressure of British imports, and political control often came with heavy-handed measures designed to suppress dissent rather than cultivate partnership. Still, India remained the empire's core until the very end. Even as other colonies gained importance or independence, even as wars reshaped global power, India's central significance never diminished. It was too valuable, too strategic, too embedded in British identity to be treated as anything less than essential. And that is the paradox. The British Empire's most important possession wasn't next door. It wasn't convenient. It wasn't culturally similar. Its beating heart was 5,000 miles away, because that heart pumped the Empire's wealth, power and self-image across the planet. When people talk about the British Empire, they often focus on soldiers, ships and treaties. But the Empire's most persistent legacy wasn't carved with cannons. It was carried in chalk dust, dictionaries, teacups and leather-bound rulebooks for a sport nobody fully understood at first. Britain didn't just conquer land. It exported culture with the enthusiasm of someone handing out free samples. And whether the world liked it or not, it ended up walking away with English phrases, cricket scores, Shakespeare plays, and a deep, inexplicable familiarity with tea. Unlike territorial expansion, cultural expansion didn't always need permission. It seeped across borders, moved with administrators, missionaries, teachers, merchants, railway builders and travellers. And because it often looked harmless, just words, games, systems, schools, it embedded itself more deeply than empire ever intended. Language was Britain's most influential export. English spread far beyond the island not because it was uniquely logical, it absolutely isn't, nor because it was easy to learn, also debatable, but because the empire insisted on using it for governance, trade and education. If you wanted a government job, you learned English. If you wanted to negotiate with officials, write petitions or attend certain schools, you learned English. Over time, local elites became bilingual, then multilingual societies developed, and eventually English became the global middle ground, the linguistic waiting room where everyone could meet. The funny part, Britain never planned for English to become a global language. It simply used the language it had on hand, unaware that future generations would one day argue on the internet using idioms inherited from Victorian clerks. Education was the next cultural courier. Schools sprang up throughout the empire teaching curricula designed in London. Students in Africa studied British geography. Students in India memorised English poetry. Students in the Caribbean learned about European monarchs who had never heard of their islands. Education became one of Britain's most powerful and controversial tools. On the one hand, it created new opportunities. On the other, it imposed a worldview that centred Britain as the norm and treated local cultures as side notes. Classrooms became spaces where identity shifted. Students encountered new concepts, new histories, and a vocabulary that shaped how they understood the world. Graduates of these schools often became civil servants, lawyers, journalists, or reformers, roles that allowed them to influence society. Ironically, some of the empire's most formidable critics were educated in institutions Britain had built, using the very tools Britain had taught them. The empire didn't just educate supporters, it educated future revolutionaries. Then there was law and custom. British legal systems spread across continents, bringing with them courts, codes, property principles, and the elaborate rituals of British justice. In some colonies, these systems replaced local traditions. In others, they layered awkwardly on top of them, creating legal hybrids that still shape national frameworks today. Habeas corpus, jury trials, contract law, these became part of the colonial fabric. Yet the legal export wasn't merely about justice, it was about familiarity. Britain believed the empire functioned better if the rules looked the same everywhere, even when the local population had completely different traditions of mediation and conflict resolution. The result was a patchwork of legal systems with British fingerprints, and local adaptations, many of which survived long after the empire itself dissolved. Sports were the empire's most cheerful and confusing cultural export. Cricket, football, soccer, rugby, tennis. These games travelled with soldiers, bureaucrats, and merchants who were determined to recreate British leisure wherever they went. Officers set up makeshift cricket pitches in tropical heat. Civil servants formed football clubs in dusty towns. Schoolmasters introduced rugby with the unshakable certainty that nothing builds character like running headfirst into another human being. Cricket in particular became a global phenomenon, even in places where the weather was completely unsuited to wearing wool uniforms outdoors. South Asia, the Caribbean, Australia, regions separated by oceans became connected through a sport that involves tea breaks and polite applause. Cricket is perhaps the Empire's most enduring inside joke, a game so deeply British in temperament that people who had never seen snow somehow adopted it with passion. The paradox of these sports is that they were introduced as cultural glue, ways to instill Britishness, discipline, and community. Yet today, many former colonies dominate these sports in ways that Britain never imagined, turning the old imperial pastime into a post-colonial playground. Winning at cricket has become a poetic form of historic payback. Tea became the Empire's unofficial beverage ambassador. Tea drinking, once an elite luxury, became a national obsession in Britain before being exported as cultural gospel. The Empire cultivated tea in India and Ceylon, then spread the habit across colonies. Tea became a symbol of civility, of social ritual, of comfort, of shrugging at life's problems and boiling water anyway. The joke, of course, is that tea wasn't originally British at all. It travelled to Britain from China, then returned to Asia wearing a British accent. Cultural fusion became unavoidable. Empire created hybrid cuisines, languages, fashions, and traditions. Jamaican English developed its own cadence. Indian curries travelled to London and transformed British cuisine forever. Malaysian English, Singaporean English, Nigerian English. Each region shaped the language into something uniquely its own. Britain exported culture, but it also imported it, sometimes without noticing. This back and forth created a cultural world that was neither entirely British nor entirely local. Something new, layered, complicated, and permanent. But the export wasn't always welcomed. Cultural imposition could be aggressive, erasing traditions or pressuring societies to conform to British norms. Dress codes, etiquette, educational expectations, and administrative customs sometimes pushed aside local identities. Resistance grew, not only militarily, but culturally. People adapted British tools but infused them with local meaning. They learned English, but wrote poetry that defied empire. They played cricket, but turned it into a symbol of national pride. They attended British schools, then used their education to question British rule. Because cultural export is never a one-way street. People don't simply absorb, they transform. They take what arrives, break it open, remix it, and claim it. Britain may have handed out tea and cricket as if everyone had asked for them, but the world didn't respond as spectators. It responded as participants. And in that sense, the Empire's most enduring legacy wasn't dominance. It was a strange, sprawling cultural conversation that continues long after the ships and flags vanished. There comes a moment in every empire's life when it looks at the map and thinks, surely this is sustainable. For Britain, that moment arrived in the late 19th century, a period when the imperial map was shaded so aggressively red that it resembled a toddler's enthusiastic colouring project. This was the era of maximum expansion, maximum confidence, and maximum belief that the British Empire was a permanent fixture of the universe. The sun famously never set on British territory, though it did occasionally take breaks out of sheer exhaustion. This was the British Empire at its largest and loudest. Not loud in the sense of constant warfare, but loud in self-assurance, spectacle, pomp, and the sheer audacity of believing that one small island deserved to manage the affairs of a quarter of the world's population. The Victorians did not whisper about empire. They recited poems about it, hosted exhibitions about it, and installed paintings of it in dining rooms big enough to house small towns. At its peak, The empire stretched across every inhabited continent: North America, Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Australasia, and the Pacific. Its territories spanned climates ranging from Canadian snow to Australian deserts to Hong Kong's subtropical heat. From London, the world seemed simultaneously vast and accessible. Telegraph cables transmitted messages across oceans with astonishing speed, while steamships moved people and goods from colony to colony like a global postal system. If Chapter 10 gave Britain the industrial power to expand, Chapter 13 is where Britain used that power to its fullest extent. The empire's reach wasn't just geographic, it was administrative, economic, cultural, and psychological. British officials presided over territories so far apart that their internal clocks disagreed with each other by half a day. Governors sent instructions to islands they might never visit. Colonial capitals hummed with bureaucracy, trade, and the unique chaos of trying to govern local realities, using instructions written in offices several time zones away. The empire operated on the assumption that distance could be overcome by paperwork and optimism. This was also the age of global exhibitions, where Britain showcased imperial achievements with theatrical flair. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace, an enormous glass wonderland constructed in London, displayed goods from across the empire and beyond. British visitors wandered through displays of machinery, textiles, spices, minerals, and artifacts gathered from territories they had only seen on maps. The empire was presented not merely as political possession, but as an endless catalogue of marvels that Britain curated for the world. It was colonialism disguised as a world fair. The Victorians elevated empire into ideology. Schoolchildren memorised lists of British colonies as if they were reciting the solar system. Newspapers printed maps that highlighted British possessions in bright red, making the empire look not only dominant but visually unavoidable. Literature, lectures, paintings and speeches reinforced the belief that empire was destiny. Missionaries framed it as moral duty. Politicians framed it as national security. Business leaders framed it as global opportunity. Whether sincerely believed or conveniently justified, the narrative was everywhere. Britain had the empire because Britain deserved the empire. But for all the confidence, the empire at its peak was also fragile. Beneath the surface of victory and grandeur lay enormous pressures, political, financial, and human. Governing vast territories required coordination that bordered on the impossible. Local resistance simmered across colonies, from Ireland to India to Africa. The empire's internal contradictions, its diversity, its inequalities, its competing interests, pulled at its seams. Yet outwardly, Britain carried itself with an almost theatrical composure, as if nothing could shake its global authority. The sheer variety of the empire was bewildering. Canada, with its parliamentary structure and cold winters, required an entirely different approach from, say, Nigeria, where British control leaned heavily on indirect rule through local leaders. Australia and New Zealand developed settler societies closely tied to Britain, while colonies in Africa and Asia were ruled through complex systems of administration that blended British law with local structures. The empire was not one thing, it was a mosaic of dozens of very different realities. Still, this diversity was framed as evidence of Britain's genius. No matter the region, climate, or historical context, British administrators believed they could manage it with a mix of law, railways, persuasion, and occasionally gunboats. To the Victorian imagination, the empire was not simply territory. It was a civilizing mission, an economic network, and a global identity all rolled into one. Queen Victoria herself became a symbol of imperial stability. Her long reign embodied the idea that empire was permanent, orderly, and guided by a steady hand. Statues of her rose across the territories. Her image appeared in government buildings, coins, schools, and public squares from Cape Town to Calcutta. The British Empire wasn't just a political system, it was a brand, and Queen Victoria was its logo. Economic reach strengthened this sense of invincibility. British banks, insurers, and investors held stakes in projects across the globe. British companies operated mines in Africa, plantations in Asia, railways in India, shipping lines in the Pacific, and trading networks everywhere in between. London was the financial beating heart of the world. Transactions, gold movements, credit lines, and stock exchanges pulsed in sync with British imperial interests. Yet every empire built on confidence carries within it the seeds of overconfidence. Britain mistook global size for global control. It mistook loyalty for permanence. It mistook its own industrial superiority for an eternal advantage. This period felt stable, inevitable, and everlasting. That was the mistake. The empire at its loudest was also the empire most convinced it would never fall. And history has never been kind to empires that assume they are immortal. But in this moment, this chapter, Britain stood atop the world, red on the map, steam in its engines, telegraph wires humming, industries roaring, and officials writing reports that described their empire as if it were a planet unto itself. The sun truly never set. But it was getting tired. For all its maps shaded red and all its speeches about destiny, the British Empire was never a one-sided affair. Wherever Britain planted a flag, someone, often many someones, objected. Sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, sometimes with petitions, sometimes with uprisings, sometimes with the immortal power of no, we're not doing that. Empire was never just Britain imposing itself on the world. It was also the world responding, resisting, negotiating, and refusing to go along politely. From the moment Britain acquired territories, resistance emerged as a constant background hum, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a roar. These responses weren't isolated incidents but part of a continuous global conversation in which the empire kept announcing its intentions and populations kept responding, "Actually, we disagree." The forms resistance took were astonishingly varied. In some regions, the first line of defence was diplomacy, local rulers attempting to negotiate, reinterpret treaties, or limit British influence. These early resistances often came from leaders who recognised danger long before the British presence became permanent. They protested new taxes, opposed company interference, or refused alliances intended to chip away at their independence. Their resistance was political, strategic, and rooted in long histories of local governance that didn't fit neatly into Britain's plans. Elsewhere, resistance erupted through large-scale uprisings. Colonised people weren't passive spectators in the imperial project. They fought, fiercely, creatively, and often at enormous cost. In North America, indigenous nations resisted British encroachment with alliances, warfare, and negotiations that reshaped colonial boundaries repeatedly. In the Caribbean, enslaved Africans resisted through revolts, escapes, sabotage, and cultural endurance. Enslaved resistance was a constant force, an ongoing struggle that undermined plantation stability and ultimately contributed to abolitionist momentum. India saw some of the most organised and formidable resistance movements. Long before independence became the central goal, rulers fought to maintain sovereignty, peasants rebelled against exploitative policies, and soldiers mutinied when pushed past their limits. The 1857 rebellion, massive, complex, and brutally repressed, was not an isolated explosion, but the culmination of decades of tension. It shook the empire so profoundly that Britain dissolved the East India Company, restructured colonial governance, and realised that ruling India would never be as stable as the Victorian imagination preferred. In Africa, resistance varied from guerrilla campaigns to diplomatic standoffs. Leaders like the Ashanti, Zulu, and Ndebele mounted dramatic defences against British incursions. Some battles became legendary, acts of defiance carried out despite being outgunned and outnumbered. Other forms of resistance were smaller, but equally significant, refusing labour demands, relocating communities, or continuing cultural practices the empire tried to suppress. Colonial rule faced resistance not only when Britain tried to take land, but also when it tried to reshape society. And then there were the unofficial forms of resistance, the kinds that don't always appear in textbooks but matter just as much. Small acts of non-compliance, tax evasion disguised with impressive creativity, workers slowing the pace of production, students mocking British teachers behind their backs and occasionally to their faces, villagers ignoring new regulations that made no sense, people continuing to speak their own languages despite official pressures. These were the daily rejections of imperial authority, subtle, persistent expressions of autonomy. Culture itself became a front line. The empire brought its own institutions, schools, courts, churches, clubs, but people shaped, resisted, and redefined them. They attended British schools, then used their education to form nationalist movements. They learned English, then wrote speeches demanding independence. They played British sports, then turned those sports into symbolic battlegrounds. Resistance wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was intellectual, political, cultural, or humorous. Empire wanted uniformity. People wanted dignity. Nationalist movements eventually transformed resistance into organised political force. Newspapers spread anti-colonial ideas. Writers critiqued imperial policies. Lawyers dismantled colonial laws piece by piece. Activists formed associations, unions, and congresses. Students became leaders. Teachers became revolutionaries. Workers became organisers. The empire faced not only swords and rifles, but ideas about rights, identity, equality, and self-determination. What Britain often underestimated was the simple fact that its subjects had their own visions of the future. They didn't see themselves as parts of a global managerial project headquartered in London. They saw themselves as communities with histories older than the empire and futures beyond it. Their resistance was rooted not only in suffering under imperial rule, but also in pride, memory, and the basic human instinct to shape one's own destiny. Resistance also revealed the limits of imperial power. Britain could establish laws, but it couldn't fully control whether people obeyed them. It could win battles, but it couldn't permanently eliminate dissent. It could build railways, but it couldn't dictate how people travelled once they existed. Everywhere the empire exerted force, resistance reshaped how that force was received. Even in territories with strong British influence, resistance appeared in unexpected ways. In settler colonies like Australia and Canada, indigenous peoples fought for survival, land, and cultural preservation, even when imperial narratives tried to erase or downplay their resistance. These struggles continue into the present, reminders that empire's impact did not end with political independence. By the 20th century, resistance had become unstoppable. Movements grew sophisticated, coordinated, and impossible to silence. Mass protests spread from Cairo to Calcutta, Nairobi to Kingston. Britain faced moral, political, and logistical challenges it could no longer suppress. Decolonization didn't happen because Britain changed its mind. It happened because resistance, long-standing, global, determined, made imperial rule untenable. And through it all, one truth was constant. No matter how confident or expansive the British Empire became, someone, somewhere, always said no, sometimes with rebellion, sometimes with protest, sometimes with quiet, stubborn refusal. Resistance was not an exception to empire. It was its companion, present from the first flag raised to the last flag lowered. For all its pomp, confidence, and boundless ambition, the British Empire had one colossal weakness. It was too big for its own good. Running a country is hard. Running a continent is harder. Running an empire scattered across oceans, climates, languages, and time zones using 19th century technology was a logistical nightmare dressed in a red military coat. The empire's daily operations were less global mastery and more extreme long-distance problem-solving by postal service. managing the world by mail was exactly as chaotic as it sounds. The empire stretched so far that sunrise in one colony lined up with deep night in another. Governors in Australia wrote letters to London that took months to arrive, months filled with storms, piracy risks, and the occasional ship deciding it preferred to sink rather than deliver paperwork. By the time London replied, the governor who wrote the letter might have retired, died, or solved the problem using improvisation and mild panic. Instructions issued from Whitehall were often outdated before they reached their destination. Policies crafted in calm committee rooms had to be implemented in environments their authors had never seen. Imagine receiving a letter that begins, "In response to your urgent crisis," and realizing the crisis was last year. The empire's communication problem created a world of semi-autonomous decision-makers, governors, commissioners, administrators, officers, who acted first and asked permission later. They had to. Emergencies didn't wait for mail ships. When famine threatened, borders shifted, rebellions sparked, or storms destroyed infrastructure, local officials responded in ways they thought appropriate, not in ways London would necessarily approve. The result was a patchwork of decisions, of styles, brilliant, disastrous, cautious, reckless, all woven into the imperial fabric. This meant that no one at any point fully controlled the empire. London tried, colonial capitals tried, admirals and field officers tried, but the truth was simple. The empire operated on delayed reactions. A rebellion in Africa could be over by the time news reached England. A treaty signed in India might contradict a policy being drafted at that very moment in Parliament. Empire was not a neat system. It was a collection of spinning plates on wobbly poles, managed by people who had to pray the wind didn't pick up. Logistics made everything harder. Moving goods, soldiers, officials and supplies across continents required Herculean effort. Ships needed to be built, dockyards maintained, ports expanded, and shipping lanes protected. Coal stations had to be established along long-distance steam routes. Warehouses needed to store thousands of tons of material, and once items reached their destination, they had to be transported inland via rivers, railways, horses, camels, carts, or the eternal power of men hauling things in the heat. A single military expedition required staggering quantities of material, weapons, ammunition, spare parts, tents, uniforms, medical supplies, food, water, animals to carry the supplies, and people to take care of the animals carrying the supplies. And all of this had to be sent from thousands of miles away. One miscalculation, like forgetting how long it takes for biscuits to go stale crossing the ocean, and an entire campaign could fall apart. Administrative logistics were just as exhausting. Tax systems had to be implemented across societies with completely different economic traditions. Records had to be kept in dozens of languages. Courts had to function even when local law and British law collided. Schools, prisons, police forces, irrigation networks, customs offices and postal routes all had to be built, maintained and supervised. The empire wasn't a monolith. It was a collection of dozens of overlapping demands, each one shouting for attention, and attention was limited. Each colony believed its concerns were urgent. Each governor believed their reports deserved priority. London, drowning in paperwork, believed everyone needed to calm down immediately. The empire had to triage crises, often deciding which region to stabilise today and which to stabilise after the monsoon season, or maybe next year. Overstretch wasn't a future threat. It was a daily condition. Financial overstretch compounded the problem. Maintaining garrisons, building railways, paying civil servants, funding telegraph lines, and supporting naval bases drained enormous resources. A single war or rebellion in one part of the empire could destabilise budgets for years. Even prosperous colonies required constant investment to remain loyal, productive, and governable. For every profitable territory there were several that cost far more than they produced. but which Britain refused to abandon because prestige demanded otherwise. Prestige was expensive. The empire also strained human endurance. Officials worked far from home for years, sometimes decades, battling isolation, illness, climate shock, and the psychological wear of being responsible for entire regions with minimal oversight. Soldiers rotated through unfamiliar environments, from African heat to Himalayan cold to tropical disease zones. Missionaries, traders, engineers, surveyors, and teachers scattered across continents lived lives defined by distance. Distance from Britain, from family, and from anyone who fully understood their world. With such distances came culture clashes that no amount of paperwork could neatly organise. Britain expected uniformity. Colonies delivered diversity. What worked in Canada didn't work in Burma. What succeeded in New Zealand failed spectacularly in Sudan. Each administrative challenge required new strategies, draining energy and stretching capacity until the empire's machinery creaked like an overworked steam engine. The undeniable truth was this: empire management required impossible efficiency from a world still reliant on slow ships and slower bureaucracy. The empire could conquer fast, but it could not manage fast. It could expand rapidly, but it could not coordinate rapidly. Its ambition outpaced its abilities, and its global sprawl became both its pride and its burden. Managing the empire wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. An endless attempt to synchronize dozens of societies under the control of a government that communicated through paper envelopes carried by wind and waves. Because when you try to run the world by mail, you're always one crisis, one storm, or one delayed letter away from chaos. At its height, the British Empire sprawled across oceans, climates, and cultures like a tenant who keeps renting every apartment on the block just to prove they can. But maintaining a global empire wasn't cheap. It was financially ravenous. Empire required armies, navies, administrators, railways, cables, ports, treaties, and an endless stream of money poured into places that did not always, or often, pay Britain back. Running the world was not a profit-making scheme. It was expensive rent on a property so large that Britain sometimes lost track of what it actually owned. And as the empire expanded, so did the bill. The first and most obvious cost was military. A vast empire required constant protection, from rival European powers, from rebellions, from pirates, from smugglers, from anyone who disagreed with British tax policy, which was a lot of people. Troops were stationed across continents, often in remote and inhospitable conditions. Garrisons had to be fed, clothed, armed, housed, and rotated. Officers demanded salaries, soldiers demanded rum, horses demanded hay, and everything demanded transportation. The Navy, Britain's proudest institution, consumed funds at a rate unmatched by any other government department. Warships were expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and expensive to repair when they inevitably collided with storms, rocks, or each other. Shipyards had to be stocked with timber, iron, rope, tar, sails, anchors, masts, gunpowder, cannonballs, and, crucially, workers. The Royal Navy was the Empire's shield, but it was also a hungry beast that ate budgets whole. Then came the infrastructure. Building an empire required far more than soldiers and ships. It required railways to move goods and troops, roads to connect administrative centres, telegraph lines to communicate or miscommunicate across continents, ports to handle the empire's maritime lifeline, hospitals for troops and officials, schools to train civil servants, and of course, the grand administrative buildings where colonial officials wrote lengthy reports about why all these things were necessary. In some places, these investments paid off through trade or taxation. In others, they didn't pay off at all. Territories that looked promising on maps often turned out to be expensive commitments with little financial return. The empire's far-flung nature meant that some colonies operated at a constant deficit, requiring subsidies from London just to maintain basic governance. Britain found itself funding regions whose main contribution was geopolitical bragging rights. Bragging rights are not bankable assets. Economic strain also came from defending the empire against Europe's endless rivalries. Wars fought thousands of miles away drained the treasury. Even peaceful decades were costly, as Britain maintained a defensive posture across multiple continents. And when conflicts erupted, whether in Africa, Asia, or the Middle East, the costs skyrocketed instantly. Mobilizing troops, transporting them by ship, supplying them, and sustaining them for long campaigns consumed enormous sums. Empire required money during peacetime and demanded even more during wartime. Meanwhile, the world economy was shifting. Industrialization had transformed Britain into a global manufacturing powerhouse, but being everywhere at once meant competing everywhere at once. Other nations, Germany, the United States, Japan, rose rapidly as industrial rivals. Their emergence strained British markets and forced the empire to justify its economic system repeatedly. The old assumption that colonies existed to enrich Britain became increasingly difficult to maintain as global trade changed. Political fatigue began to appear at home. The British public, for all its imperial pride, wasn't always thrilled about the price tag. Parliamentary debates frequently turned into arguments about whether certain colonies were worth the trouble. Politicians disagreed over how much military force to commit, how much money to spend, and how much responsibility Britain should carry for regions it barely understood. The empire was becoming a political headache, a vast, complicated project with constant demands. And it wasn't only politicians who were exhausted. The civil service groaned under the weight of governing people who lived vastly different lives from those in Britain. Administrators were expected to be experts in local languages, customs, politics, economies, legal systems, and geography, multiple geographies in fact, while following instructions written in London by people who had never seen a monsoon. Bureaucrats were stretched thin, overwhelmed by responsibilities that multiplied faster than staff could be trained. At the same time, colonised populations increasingly asserted their own political demands. Resistance movements gained momentum, educated elites challenged imperial authority, labourers organised, and nationalists articulated visions of independence. Meeting these challenges required negotiations, concessions, reforms, and, when officials refused, force. All of this cost money. All of this cost attention. All of this eroded Britain's ability to maintain control. The empire had become a sprawling, unmanageable mosaic. Each region needed something different. Each demanded resources. Each had its own political tensions, economic needs, and cultural dynamics. Britain wasn't managing one empire. It was managing dozens of interconnected but incompatible systems. Overstretch wasn't a distant theoretical warning. It was a daily reality. As the 20th century dawned, the strain intensified. The Boer War exposed military weaknesses and drained public support. Administrative responsibilities grew more complex. Maintaining order required reforms that Britain resisted making. The empire had become a global landlord responsible for properties scattered from the Caribbean to East Asia, each with maintenance issues, political disputes, and unpredictable tenants. This was the cost of being everywhere, not just in money, not just in manpower, but in attention, diplomacy, political capital, and moral energy. The empire was the world's largest to-do list, and Britain was a single nation trying to keep up. Even pride became expensive. Prestige couldn't be abandoned, even when the costs outweighed the benefits. Colonies were sometimes maintained not because they were useful, but because letting them go felt like admitting failure. And in imperial logic, losing territory, even unprofitable territory, was psychologically unacceptable. So Britain kept paying, and paying, and paying. Empire was expensive rent that came due every day, in every region, in every crisis. And eventually Britain discovered that no amount of pride, power, or paperwork could indefinitely maintain the cost of trying to be everywhere at once. When World War I erupted in 1914, the British Empire marched into it with confidence, an empire at its zenith, convinced that size equaled stability, and that victory, while costly, would reaffirm its global dominance. Instead, the war became the moment the empire discovered that being enormous did not make you unbreakable. Total war didn't just kill soldiers and consume resources, it punched deep holes in imperial finances, authority, psychology, and the myth of invincibility Britain had been polishing for decades. By the time the armistice was signed, the empire still stood, but it was bruised, shaken, indebted, and quietly wondering if winning had been worth the invoice. The cracks began even before the first battles ended. Mobilising for global war required something Britain had been struggling with for years: money on a massive scale. Maintaining the empire was already expensive. Fighting a modern industrial war was financially catastrophic. Armaments, rations, uniforms, ships, artillery shells, medical supplies, and the wages of millions of soldiers devoured government budgets at a pace no colonial treasury could match. Britain sold assets, raised taxes, borrowed heavily from these United States, and printed money. The empire didn't just strain financially, it bled cash, and every expense had echoes. When Britain pulled economic resources toward Europe, its colonies felt the vacuum. Trade routes shifted, shipping capacity dropped, commodity markets swung wildly. Colonies supplying raw materials were suddenly under pressure to increase output, at a time when ships were being diverted for war service. Local economies bent under the stress. Some broke. Then there was the human cost. The Empire's soldiers didn't all come from Britain. Troops from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa joined the fighting. The Imperial Army became a vast multi-ethnic force bound by loyalty, obligation, or necessity. This produced moments of heroism and tragedy. In the trenches, on the Middle Eastern front at Gallipoli in East Africa, where colonial troops fought and died far from home. But what Britain failed to anticipate was how participation in the war would change expectations. Soldiers who fought for freedom and civilization returned to societies where they themselves lacked political freedom. Veterans who had bled for the empire began asking uncomfortable questions. If we're good enough to fight for you, why aren't we good enough to govern ourselves? Total war did not just mobilise armies, it mobilised ideas, and those ideas did not return quietly. World War I also revealed the empire's military and logistical limits. Britain controlled a vast domain, but coordinating warfare across multiple theatres proved exhausting. Supply lines stretched thin. Communication technologies, though improved, still lagged behind the demands of global conflict. Troops had to be moved across oceans patrolled by submarines. The Royal Navy, once uncontested ruler of the seas, suddenly faced a new type of warfare: silent, underwater, and lethal. U-boats cut shipping lines and exposed vulnerabilities Britain hadn't imagined. The Empire's logistical machine groaned, sputtered, and required emergency repairs at every turn. The war strained not only Britain's finances, but its confidence. Pre-war imperial ideology, rooted in certainty, in assumed superiority, in the belief that Britain had a unique civilizing mission, collided violently with industrial slaughter. The same empire that lectured the world on order suddenly plunged into the most disorderly conflict humanity had ever created. Millions died in mud, gas, and artillery fire. Glory evaporated. Idealism drowned. The empire's self-image, as rational, moral, and destined to rule, took a hit that Parliament speeches and victory parades could not fully patch. Across the empire, the war also disrupted political balances. In Ireland, resentment toward British rule was already simmering. War shortages, heavy-handed recruitment policies, and the Easter Rising of 1916 turned simmering tensions into political fracture. In India, wartime promises of reform led to heightened expectations and immediate disappointment when those promises proved limited and slow. In Egypt, wartime exploitation and martial law fueled nationalist movements. In Africa, forced labour, heavy taxation, and wartime requisitions deepened resistance. The war had another embarrassing side effect. It revealed Britain's dependence on its colonies. When shortages hit, when manpower ran low, when debts piled up, the empire leaned heavily on colonial contributions, economically, militarily, and strategically. That dependence weakened the illusion that Britain alone upheld the empire. It became clear that the empire upheld Britain too. Then came 1919, the year of peace treaties and broken illusions. Britain emerged victorious, technically speaking, but it felt as if the empire had aged a century. The Treaty of Versailles granted Britain new territories under the mandate system, expanding the empire's size, but these new holdings were not signs of strength, they were burdens. The empire had physically grown while its capacity to manage growth had shrunk. And the war changed the global stage. The United States emerged as a financial superpower. Japan expanded its influence in Asia. Anti-colonial movements awakened. Meanwhile, Britain was saddled with debts so heavy that it would take generations to pay off. Military spending remained high. Colonial demands multiplied. Domestic unemployment surged. The empire was victorious, but victory felt suspiciously like losing. Most damaging of all was the psychological unravelling. World War I shattered the European belief that empires were natural, unshakable, and ordained. The war exposed imperialism as vulnerable, fallible, and human, an enterprise run by governments that could make catastrophic mistakes. The empire that once projected unbreakable confidence began projecting something else: exhaustion. In the years after the war, the British Empire still looked powerful on maps. It still held vast territories. It still made grand declarations about global responsibility. But inside, the foundation was cracked. The costs had mounted. The certainties had eroded. The future felt heavier, more complicated, and far less permanent. Britain had won the war, but in the process it had lost something vital. The illusion that empire was sustainable forever. Because sometimes winning truly does feel suspiciously like losing. One of history's greatest ironies is that the British Empire, for all its efforts to maintain control, accidentally handed its colonies the exact tools needed to dismantle it. Britain exported schools, courts, constitutions, parliaments, civic institutions, newspapers, and an entire political vocabulary built on rights, representation, liberty, and rule of law. These were meant to strengthen the empire. Instead, they became the instruction manual for taking it apart. Because as it turned out, once you teach people the language of freedom, they tend to ask why they don't have any. Nationalism in the colonies didn't appear as a spontaneous thunderbolt. It emerged gradually through decades of schooling, debate, reform movements, social clubs, political groups, and the slow realization that the empire's promises rarely matched its practices. Where Britain preached justice, colonized people experienced inequality. Where Britain praised self-government, colonized people encountered authoritarian rule. Where Britain lectured about liberty, colonized people saw restrictions, surveillance, and laws designed to protect imperial authority above all else. The contradiction was glaring, and educated elites across the empire became experts at spotting it. These elites were often graduates of British-style schools, people who had read Shakespeare, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and parliamentary debates. They could quote British theorists on rights more accurately than many British officials. They attended universities in London, Oxford, and Cambridge. They studied law in the Inns of Court. They travelled, debated, observed, and took notes. They learned how Britain justified its own freedom and governance, and then they applied the same logic to themselves. Indian nationalists demanded representation in legislatures because Britain had taught them that taxation required consent. Egyptian nationalists quoted British ideals about liberty while campaigning against martial law. West African journalists used British press traditions to challenge colonial policies. Caribbean intellectuals wrote essays that mirrored British political argumentation, except the conclusion was, and therefore, colonial rule contradicts your own principles. In short, they read the instruction manual, and then they used it to ask for a refund. Early nationalist movements weren't necessarily calling for independence. Many asked for reform, equality, or a fair share in governance. They wanted to participate in the imperial system Britain claimed was universal and just. But time after time, these requests were either ignored, delayed, or answered with partial measures that revealed how limited Britain's willingness to share power really was. The empire wanted loyalty, not equality. It wanted cooperation, not partnership. And it wanted admiration, not accountability. These refusals transformed reformers into nationalists. In India, the Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, initially requested modest political rights. But as decades passed and wartime sacrifices were rewarded with disappointingly small reforms, Congress evolved into a mass movement demanding self-rule. Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, and countless others weren't outsiders. They were individuals deeply familiar with British institutions, British rhetoric, and British political traditions. They wielded these tools with precision, transforming imperial ideals into anti-imperial demands. In Ireland, the long struggle for autonomy evolved into a complex nationalist project that combined cultural revival with political confrontation. Irish leaders mastered parliamentary strategy, legal argumentation, and electoral organisation, skills sharpened inside the very system they sought to escape. When peaceful methods failed, frustration fed rebellion, and rebellion fed new political structures. In Africa, West African coastal elites, lawyers, teachers, merchants, became the early architects of nationalist thought. Their newspapers debated political rights using the empire's own vocabulary. Meanwhile, in East and Central Africa, resistance mixed local traditions with modern political frameworks. Leaders like Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah were educated in systems that Britain had designed, then returned home with ideas Britain wished they'd forgotten. In Southeast Asia, nationalist movements similarly blended British constitutional logic with local identity. Burmese, Malaysian, and Singaporean political groups studied parliamentary procedure so thoroughly that their demands became impeccably structured and increasingly impossible for Britain to deflect with vague promises. Britain didn't simply spread administration and law, it spread expectations. Once people learned how parliaments worked, it became awkward to tell them they couldn't have one. Once people learned that citizens had rights, it became difficult to explain why colonial subjects didn't. Britain unintentionally created a political literacy that made empire indefensible under its own stated values. Nationalism also learned the rules of communication. Newspapers became platforms for organising. Pamphlets spread ideas that imperial censors struggled to contain. Public meetings turned into mass movements. Politically engaged citizens took advantage of every loophole in British legal codes, appealing court cases, organising unions, drafting petitions, forming associations and establishing political parties. Britain had constructed systems meant for stability. Nationalists turned those systems into engines of resistance. But nationalism wasn't only political, it was cultural. Colonised societies revived languages, literature, art and traditions that imperial rule had tried to sideline. They blended modern political thought with local identity, creating a sense of unity that transcended region, religion and ethnicity. This cultural resurgence gave nationalism emotional weight. People were no longer fighting only for rights. They were fighting for the right to define themselves. World War I accelerated everything. The war exposed Britain's dependence on colonial resources. It revealed the limits of British power. It spread anti-colonial ideas faster than censors could suppress them. And it created veterans who knew that the empire's claims about freedom and justice were selective at best. Nationalism grew louder, broader, and more coordinated. Colonial governments responded with a mixture of concessions and coercion. Partial reforms here, constitutional councils there. Always too little, always too late. When protests grew, the empire answered with arrests, surveillance, bans, and force. But every crackdown backfired. deepening nationalist resolve. By the 1920s and 1930s, nationalism wasn't a fringe aspiration. It was a worldwide movement. British officials increasingly found themselves negotiating not with isolated leaders, but with entire populations who had absorbed, repurposed, and weaponized British political logic. The empire had taught its subjects how to argue, how to organize, how to govern, and how to demand what Britain had long denied them. And the colonies replied, in Britain's own language, "We want rights, we want laws, we want representation, and we want them without an empire attached." Nationalism didn't overthrow the empire in one dramatic moment. It dismantled it piece by piece, petition by petition, protest by protest, election by election, using the empire's own intellectual tools as pry bars. Because when you give people the instruction manual for freedom, you shouldn't be surprised when they learn to use it. World War II didn't simply challenge the British Empire. It quietly, steadily, and decisively ended the illusion that the empire could last. Britain entered the war still clinging to the idea that its global dominance was both natural and durable. It emerged 6 years later victorious but hollowed out, financially drained, politically weakened, and forced to confront a truth it had avoided for decades. An empire that rules the world cannot survive when it can no longer pay its bills, defend its territory, or convince anyone, including itself, that imperial rule makes sense. The war struck the empire at every structural weakness. The first and most catastrophic was money. If World War I had strained Britain's finances, World War II detonated them. Fighting a modern mechanised war required unimaginable expenditure, far beyond what Britain could sustain alone. Planes, tanks, ships, ammunition, radar systems, vehicles, fuel, food, uniforms, replacement parts, medical units, and global deployments drained the Treasury faster than Parliament could print emergency authorisations. Britain sold investments, liquidated overseas assets, and borrowed so heavily from the United States that by 1945 it owed more money than it had ever earned from its empire. The empire didn't pay for the war. The war paid for the end of the empire. Then there was defence, or rather, the empire's inability to defend itself. Germany's early victories shook Britain, but what truly cracked imperial confidence was Japan's lightning expansion in Asia. Colonial territories that Britain had long assumed were secure, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Burma, collapsed with shocking speed. The fall of Singapore in 1942 was especially humiliating. Britain had called it an impregnable fortress. Japan took it in a week. That moment reverberated across Asia. A supposedly invincible empire had proven alarmingly vincible. Millions across the colonies saw something that British propaganda had never allowed them to imagine. Britain could lose. And once people see that, they don't forget it. At the same time, colonial subjects were participating in the war in unprecedented numbers. Troops from India, Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere fought in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. They defended a country that didn't give them equality, citizenship, or political rights. When they returned home, they carried new expectations and a new unwillingness to accept the old imperial hierarchy. Wartime service gave them a powerful moral argument. If we were good enough to die for you, we are good enough to govern ourselves. This logic did not require Britain's approval. It required Britain's exhaustion, which the war provided in abundance. Meanwhile, the global political landscape had changed beyond recognition. Two new superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both opposed old-style colonial empires, though for very different reasons. The US opposed empire in principle, and in practice, because it wanted influence in former colonies. The Soviet Union opposed empire ideologically, and actively supported anti-colonial movements whenever it could. Britain found itself squeezed by two giants who agreed on almost nothing except that European imperialism no longer belonged in the modern world. And inside Britain itself, public opinion had shifted dramatically. The war created demands for domestic reconstruction, housing, healthcare, employment, education. After 6 years of deprivation, rationing, bombing and grief, British citizens wanted resources spent at home, not overseas. The election of Clement Attlee in 1945 signalled a national pivot towards social welfare and rebuilding. Empire was suddenly seen not as a source of pride, but as a drain, an expensive luxury when Britain couldn't afford luxuries of any kind. Even the mechanics of empire were collapsing. The administrative machinery was overstretched. The military was tired. The treasury was empty. The illusion of control had evaporated. India, the empire's crown jewel, became the clearest example of the post-war reality. Nationalist movements had grown powerful, organised, and impatient. Britain, unable to suppress them and unwilling to risk full-scale rebellion, conceded independence in 1947. The speed of the transition was stunning and symbolic. If Britain couldn't hold on to India, its imperial centrepiece, the rest of the empire seemed suddenly negotiable. Across Asia, independence movements surged. Burma, Ceylon, Malaya and others pressed their claims. Britain recognised that resisting these movements would require military campaigns it could neither finance nor justify. In Africa, political consciousness grew rapidly. In the Middle East, British influence weakened under the combined weight of nationalist movements, international pressure and shifting strategic priorities. Meanwhile, the empire's economic structure had collapsed. The war disrupted trade networks that had taken centuries to build. British industry was damaged. Global markets shifted toward American production. Sterling lost its status as the world's dominant currency. The prosperity that had once justified empire was gone. Britain needed Marshall Plan aid from the United States, aid that came with the subtle implication: maybe you should rethink owning half the planet. By the late 1940s, the message was unavoidable. Britain might still wear the imperial crown, but the world had revoked its sceptre. The final blow wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a rebellion or a battle. It was a realization, a quiet, undeniable truth. Empire no longer made sense, not economically, not politically, not morally, not strategically. World War II didn't destroy the British Empire overnight. It simply made the idea of empire incompatible with the world that emerged afterward. Britain had won the war, but victory came with eviction notices, delivered by debt, by nationalism, by geopolitics, and by the war's staggering cost. After 1945, the empire didn't collapse. It exhaled and began to let go. When the British Empire finally began to unravel after World War II, it didn't fade slowly or gracefully. It fell apart with the speed and chaos of a tenant who suddenly realizes the landlord is changing the locks tomorrow. Independence movements that had simmered for decades suddenly found the door open, or at least unlocked, and they rushed through it with astonishing momentum. Britain, exhausted and financially drained, tried to keep up with the pace of decolonization while pretending it had everything under control. But the truth was simpler and far more chaotic. The empire was moving out without packing. From 1947 onward, decolonization accelerated into a global cascade. India and Pakistan's independence was the beginning of a trend that Britain could neither reverse nor slow without risking catastrophic political fallout. Once the largest and most important colony slipped away, the symbolic weight of empire collapsed. The British government tried to frame the process as planned, orderly, even benevolent. Phrases like peaceful transfer of power filled official documents. But on the ground, the process was often messy, rushed, reactive, and shaped by forces far beyond Britain's grasp. One fundamental truth drove the chaos. Britain was no longer in control. Nationalist leaders, not British officials, dictated the pace. In South Asia, independence was both triumphant and tragic. Partition created two new nations in 1947, India and Pakistan. But the transition was rushed so dramatically that borders were drawn in a matter of weeks. Entire communities woke up in the wrong country. Millions fled in panic. Violence erupted on a scale that horrified the world. Britain had been the governing power for nearly 2 centuries, but when the time came to leave, it departed with astonishing speed, leaving behind confusion that would shape politics and trauma for generations. Elsewhere in Asia, movements surged one after another. Burma and Ceylon gained independence in the late 1940s. Malaya faced a communist insurgency that forced Britain into a long, complex counterinsurgency campaign, an ironic twist in which Britain fought to delay independence it knew was inevitable. The empire that once claimed to bring order now scrambled to manage disorder long enough to negotiate exits that didn't further destabilise the region. In the Middle East, decolonization came with strategic frustration. Britain withdrew from Palestine in 1948, leaving a conflict behind that would shape global politics long after the empire was gone. In Egypt, nationalist pressure culminated in revolution in 1952, ending British influence in one of the empire's most symbolically important regions. The Suez Crisis in 1956, the moment Britain tried to reassert authority and failed spectacularly, made clear that imperial intervention was no longer possible in a world dominated by American and Soviet power. Africa presented a new challenge altogether. Dozens of colonies, each with different histories, demographics, economies, and political landscapes. Britain had long ruled many African territories indirectly, relying on alliances with local leaders. Now it had to transition them into independent states, often without adequate preparation, clear boundaries, or functional institutions. Decolonization here happened in waves, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violently contested. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence in 1957, a symbolic turning point celebrated around the world. Many others followed: Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, and so on. Some transitions were negotiated. Others came after bitter conflict, such as the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, where Britain's brutal counterinsurgency exposed the darker side of retreat. The British departure often left behind borders drawn with little regard for ethnic or cultural realities, a rushed cartography that created tensions still felt today. In the Caribbean, decolonization took a different form. Federation experiments, constitutional negotiations, and gradual transitions. Nations like Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago moved toward independence through agreements rather than revolt. But even here, the process revealed the empire's hasty exit strategy. Britain often encouraged federations, hoping to simplify governance during withdrawal, only for them to collapse under political disagreement. The message was clear: the empire didn't have a plan, it had guesses. Across the empire, the pace of independence created structural problems. Many colonies inherited governments that were barely functional, economies tied to British markets, and institutions designed not for self-rule but for imperial extraction. Trained administrators were scarce, infrastructure was uneven, legal systems were hybrids of British and local traditions. The empire left behind railways, ports, schools and hospitals, but also poverty, political fragmentation, borders drawn without community input, an economy shaped to serve Britain rather than local needs. In some places, the abruptness of departure created power vacuums. Leaders who had been united in fighting colonial rule now disagreed on how to govern. Factions formed. Civil conflicts erupted. Cold War powers intervened. The British exit didn't cause all these problems, but it accelerated them. When you move out without packing, someone else has to deal with the mess. And yet, decolonization was also a moment of profound optimism. New nations wrote constitutions, formed governments, adopted flags, and celebrated independence with parades, music, ceremonies, and promises of a better future. Britain's influence didn't vanish, but its role changed. Former colonies joined the Commonwealth, an association Britain advertised as proof of lasting friendship. Though many saw it as a gentle way of softening the end of empire, Britain's domestic identity shifted too. By the 1960s and 70s, even politicians who once supported empire recognised that the imperial project had become a historical memory rather than a political reality. British society itself was transformed by migration from former colonies, creating a multicultural landscape that reflected the empire's complicated legacy in reverse. The empire came home, not as territories but as people. By the end of the 20th century, Britain's once sprawling empire had compressed into a handful of small territories, most of them islands. The era of global dominion was gone, replaced by a quieter, more modest role in world affairs. The empire had officially ended, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a series of departures that happened so quickly that some people didn't realise they were watching global history and fast forward. If the height of empire was loud, decolonization was a frantic whisper. Pack your bags, we're leaving, right now. Except the packing never really happened. Britain won World War II, but the empire died anyway. It didn't fall, it unravelled, rapidly and messily, as the world moved on. As the British Empire dissolved with remarkable speed, something curious happened. It didn't disappear entirely. Instead, it shape-shifted. The once rigid structure of colonial control softened into a loose, voluntary association known as the Commonwealth, an arrangement that looked, at times, suspiciously like the empire rebranded as a friendlier social club. The days of conquest, governors and red-coated authority were over. What remained was, well, something like a global group chat, except Britain was no longer the admin. Influence replaced command, partnership replaced hierarchy, and the Commonwealth emerged as a kind of diplomatic afterlife for an empire that refused to vanish quietly. The shift from empire to Commonwealth wasn't sudden. Its roots stretched back to the early 20th century, when the first settlers' dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, began asserting greater autonomy. They were part of the empire, but increasingly governed themselves. The 1931 Statute of Westminster formalised this autonomy, declaring that these dominions were legally equal to Britain. In practice, this meant, you're independent, but let's stay in touch. Family, right? This early version of partnership was the empire's warm-up for the real transformation that arrived after World War II. As colonies gained independence one after another, Britain confronted an awkward question. What happens to relationships built over centuries? Once imperial rule ends, does everyone simply walk away? Do ties dissolve? Does Britain become a lonely island again, reminiscing about former glory like someone reliving their high school championship? The answer, surprisingly, was no. Many newly independent nations, India foremost among them, chose to remain connected through the Commonwealth. But this time, it was voluntary. No soldiers, no viceroys, no imperial oversight. The shift was monumental. The empire's most important jewel was now a sovereign equal, choosing association rather than obligation. When India declared it would remain in the Commonwealth despite becoming a republic, it forced Britain to adapt quickly. Membership no longer required allegiance to the crown. It required mutual agreement and shared aspirations, even if those aspirations were vague at first. Thus, the modern Commonwealth was born, not a hierarchy, not an empire, but a flexible international network held together by tradition, diplomacy, and a surprising amount of optimism. In this new arrangement, Britain acted less like a ruler and more like a host, organising summits, offering scholarships, promoting cooperation, and occasionally giving speeches that hinted at nostalgia but avoided the word empire like a sensitive allergy. Meanwhile, member countries charted their own paths. Some kept the British monarch as head of state, others became republics, and a few switched constitutional structures several times. The Commonwealth didn't mind. Its primary rule was that there were fewer rules. The organisation evolved into a platform for dialogue rather than directives. Leaders gathered periodically to discuss development, education, trade, governance, and international issues. Britain participated but no longer dictated the terms. Former colonies brought their own agendas. Many took leadership roles. Some criticised Britain openly. Others used the Commonwealth as a diplomatic arena to coordinate regional priorities. The entire structure depended not on power but on consensus, a challenge that made Commonwealth meetings resemble large family reunions, polite, chaotic, occasionally tense, and always interesting. One of the Commonwealth's most striking features was its cultural legacy. Because of colonial history, members shared certain institutions, parliaments, legal systems, sports traditions, school structures, without sharing political control. This gave the Commonwealth an unusual cohesion, a sense of familiarity without dominance. Cricket tournaments became unofficial Commonwealth assemblies. English, whether loved or begrudgingly accepted, remained a common linguistic bridge. Students studied abroad across member states. Cultural exchange flowed in both directions, no longer shaped by imperial rule but by mutual interest. But the Commonwealth wasn't merely sentimental or symbolic. It played meaningful roles in international affairs. One major example was the fight against apartheid in South Africa. Many Commonwealth nations, especially newly independent ones, pressed Britain to take a stronger stand. When South Africa refused to dismantle apartheid, it was pushed out of the Commonwealth in 1961 and only readmitted decades later after reform. In this case, the Commonwealth acted not as Britain's political extension, but as a moral coalition, forcing Britain to align with broader principles rather than nostalgia. The organisation also supported development initiatives across Africa, Asia and the Caribbean. It offered mediation in political conflicts, promoted election monitoring, and coordinated responses to economic challenges. The shift from control to support created relationships that, while uneven and sometimes strained, were no longer extracted from coercion. Still, the Commonwealth struggled with contradictions. Critics pointed out that it lacked real political power and that its influence was mostly symbolic. Others questioned whether it allowed Britain to maintain soft power under the guise of friendly cooperation. Some nations drifted away from active participation, while others embraced the Commonwealth enthusiastically. The organisation became a mixture of practical alliances, historic ties, shared institutions, and a certain degree of nostalgic theatre. But perhaps its greatest paradox was this. The Commonwealth functioned precisely because it was not the Empire. By letting go of control, Britain retained relevance. By stepping back, it remained connected. The global network that once relied on coercion now ran on voluntary cooperation. The relationship shifted from parent-child to adult equals, sometimes quarrelsome, sometimes supportive, occasionally indifferent, but always bound by a shared past that no one could erase. If the Empire was a global command centre, the Commonwealth became a global community garden, loosely organised, occasionally overgrown, but built on participation rather than force. And if the Empire once operated like a strict office manager, the Commonwealth felt like the same group chat, just with fewer rules, fewer arguments, and far fewer demands for people to pay rent. It wasn't the Empire's extension, it was its evolution, a softer, quieter network replacing the old machinery of control, a reminder that while empires fall, relationships transform. When the British Empire officially packed its bags and walked out the door, it didn't take everything with it. In fact, it left an astonishing amount behind. Legal systems, borders, bureaucracies, political habits, sports obsessions, and unresolved arguments scattered like furniture in a rented apartment. Decolonization ended Britain's direct rule, but the empire's shape still lingers in the world map, in courtrooms, in school systems, in parliaments, and even in everyday language. It is an invisible legacy, sometimes helpful, sometimes disruptive, sometimes absurd, and always unmistakably present. The most obvious inheritance is borders, but these weren't carefully crafted lines honouring cultural landscapes or historical identities. They were often drawn under intense pressure, limited knowledge, and tight deadlines. Some were sketched by officials who had never set foot in the regions they were dividing. Some were compromises between colonial priorities and geopolitical negotiations. Others were produced by rushed commissions tasked with producing boundaries before Britain's departure became official. The result? Borders that cut through ethnic groups, linguistic regions, nomadic routes, ecological zones, and historical territories. Borders that forced together communities with entirely different political traditions. Borders that created new identities, exacerbated old tensions, or generated conflicts that persist to this day. Whether in Africa, South Asia, the Caribbean, or the Middle East, many post-colonial nations inherited maps that reflected imperial convenience rather than local reality. But borders were only the architectural blueprint Britain left behind. The empire's legal DNA also persists worldwide. Common law, with its emphasis on precedent, contracts, property rights, and procedure, became the legal backbone of dozens of nations. Court structures, legal vocabulary, judicial robes, and formal courtroom rituals remained intact long after independence. For many countries, this inheritance provided stability and predictability. For others, it created systems that clashed with indigenous traditions or required decades of adaptation. Still, the influence is unmistakable. Many former colonies today have legal codes that begin with phrases like "whereas," purely because a Victorian judge liked dramatic entrances. The English language, arguably the empire's most pervasive residue, became even more widespread after independence, not because Britain forced it, but because global communication, science, business, aviation, education, and diplomacy increasingly relied on it. English became the default bridge language in multilingual countries and the global lingua franca for industries ranging from computer science to international law. Ironically, this linguistic dominance outlived the empire itself. Britain no longer controlled the language. Former colonies shaped it instead. Indian English, Nigerian English, Jamaican English, Singaporean English. Each region moulded English into something local, vibrant and distinct. The empire left the language behind, but the world claimed it, remodelled it, and expanded it far beyond Britain's imagination. Then there are the political systems Britain implanted. Parliaments, cabinets, civil services, electoral structures, and constitutional frameworks. Countless countries adopted British-style governments, complete with debates, motions, committees, and procedural theatrics. Some nations embraced parliamentary democracy wholeheartedly, others adapted it in creative ways, and some kept the structure but injected it with local logic that would leave Westminster utterly baffled. But whether functional or fragile, these systems shape political life across continents. Even the way politicians argue, campaign, and use language carries traces of imperial inheritance. The empire also left behind bureaucracy, a sprawling administrative mindset that values forms, filings, and official stamps. Civil service structures, pension systems, police organisations, and municipal frameworks often followed imperial templates long after independence. This legacy was not neutral. It could either streamline governance or complicate it, depending on local capacity and adaptation. And of course, Britain left behind sports, turning leisure activities into enduring cultural obsessions. Cricket became a national religion across South Asia and the Caribbean. Rugby gained passionate followings in Oceania and Africa. Football spread everywhere. These games, once the hobbies of colonial officers, evolved into symbols of national pride, especially when former colonies beat Britain at its own invented sports. Nothing says post-colonial confidence quite like an Indian cricket victory or a Jamaican sprinting triumph watched by millions. Education systems also retained imperial fingerprints. British-style curricula, exams, school uniforms, and university structures persisted. While many countries reformed their educational systems after independence, the original framework created a shared intellectual reference point, sometimes a strength, sometimes a constraint. literature syllabi introduced students to Shakespeare, Dickens and Austen, alongside local authors. Science and law followed British patterns. Even classroom discipline owed something to imperial preferences for order and neat handwriting. But the empire's invisible legacy wasn't only institutional or cultural, it was psychological. Colonized societies inherited complex relationships with identity, language, status, and modernity. Elites educated within British systems often found themselves navigating dual identities, locally rooted but shaped by imperial frameworks. Nations had to reconcile pre-colonial histories with post-colonial state structures, a process that varied dramatically from place to place. Britain left, but the debates about identity continued. Who are we now? Which institutions do we keep? What do we change? What traditions matter most? These questions define post-colonial politics as much as any constitutional reform. Some of the most difficult legacies were the conflicts Britain left behind. Ethnic tensions sharpened by colonial divide and rule policies, resource disputes shaped by extraction economies, and political divisions formed during the struggle for independence. Britain did not invent these tensions, but imperial policies often deepened them. When the empire departed quickly, unresolved issues were inherited by new governments. Economic patterns also remained. Many post-colonial states were structured around exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods, a model shaped by decades of imperial trade priorities. Reversing that structure required enormous effort, and in many places the echoes remain. Yet for all the complications, the empire's legacy is neither wholly negative nor wholly positive. It is layered, uneven, contradictory, and constantly evolving. Nations have spent decades, sometimes generations, repurposing what the empire left behind. Some institutions became foundations for stability, others became sources of friction, and many became hybrid creations that blend British influence with local tradition. The empire may have packed up its political authority, but its furniture is still in the living room. The maps are still on the walls, the rulebook still sits on the shelf, heavily edited by now, but recognisable, and the language echoes in every meeting, courtroom, classroom and cricket pitch. In other words, Britain left, but it left a lot behind, and much of the world is still deciding what to keep, what to replace, and what to shove into the attic forever. When the British Empire finally dissolved, Britain woke up to a strange, disorienting reality. It was still a country, just not that kind of country anymore. The island that once boasted of ruling a quarter of the world suddenly found itself managing a much smaller to-do list, a more modest budget, and an awkward question lingering in the air. Who are we now? For a nation accustomed to thinking in global scale, adjusting to post-imperial life was emotional, political, cultural, and occasionally comedic. Britain remained British, but with noticeably less globe attached. The transition began quietly. There was no single moment when Britain declared it was done being an empire. Instead, independence movement after independence movement chipped away at the imperial identity, until one day Britain looked around and realised the red splashes on world maps had faded to polite footnotes. The loss wasn't sudden, but the awareness was. Empire had been a defining feature of British identity for centuries, woven into textbooks, national myths, royal symbolism, business networks, and foreign policy. Its absence created a vacuum that required immediate psychological renovation. At first, many Britons didn't fully register what had changed. The monarchy still existed. Parliament still met. The BBC still broadcast with dignified authority. The pound still bought things. The weather was still terrible. Life went on. But beneath the surface, Britain faced a challenge it hadn't confronted in 200 years. It had to define itself without relying on global domination as a central plotline. Politicians began the process by reframing Britain's identity around diplomacy and cooperation rather than command. Britain joined NATO, helped establish the United Nations, and embraced the idea that influence could now come through alliances instead of conquest. Instead of controlling vast territories, Britain learned how to negotiate, persuade, and collaborate, skills that empires historically struggle with. The shift wasn't always smooth, but it was necessary. At the same time, British society underwent a cultural transformation. Migration from former colonies reshaped cities, workplaces, and daily life. London, Birmingham, Manchester, and other major cities became centres of multiculturalism, infused with music, food, traditions, and languages from across the Commonwealth. These changes created vibrant new identities, but also sparked political debates about what Britishness meant in a world where the British Empire existed only in archives and museum exhibits. British institutions too had to adapt. Schools gradually changed curricula that once celebrated empire with unquestioned pride. Museums reconsidered how they displayed artefacts acquired during imperial expansion. Public language shifted. Empire became an awkward word, requiring context and careful explanation. Parliamentary debates wrestled with immigration, decolonization, and Britain's global role after empire. Many Britons found themselves negotiating the tension between nostalgia for imperial grandeur and recognition of its complexities. Economically, Britain's post-empire identity required reinvention. The empire had provided markets, resources, and global commercial networks for centuries. Now Britain had to compete in a world where protectionist imperial trade systems no longer existed. It turned to Europe, leading to the creation of economic partnerships, and eventually the European Union membership that would shape decades of national debate. For some, integration with Europe felt like a natural evolution. For others, it felt like swapping one identity crisis for another. But the most profound shift occurred in the national imagination. The British story, once centred on global reach, became inward-looking and reflective. The arts captured this transition. Literature grappled with memory and empire's legacy. Films re-examined colonial narratives. Historians rewrote accounts that previous generations had polished into triumphs. Even humour evolved. Satire became a way of processing post-imperial awkwardness, poking fun at Britain's habit of acting like a major world power, while quietly acknowledging its changed status. Society developed a new tone, proud but self-deprecating, aware of its past but careful not to glorify it. The famous British wit acquired a post-imperial flavour, dry, reflective, and occasionally resigned. The empire had ended, but tea-drinking, queuing, and mild inconvenience complaints persisted with unshakable enthusiasm. Identity shifted from global ruler to charming middle power trying its best. Foreign policy also recalibrated. Without the empire, Britain became a country that relied on diplomacy, soft power, culture, and international institutions. The BBC, British universities, the English language, theatre, fashion, finance, and creativity all became tools of influence. Where gunboats once sailed, now scholarships, film exports, and cultural exchanges carried the British presence. Instead of ruling the world, Britain began participating in it. Yet the post-imperial era was not free from contradictions or tensions. Even decades after decolonization, memories of the empire remained politically charged. Some longed for imperial certainty and imagined the past as simpler and more glorious than it ever truly was. Others pushed for deeper examination of empire's harms and legacies. Britain became a country in conversation with itself, debating statutes, curriculum, migration, and the meaning of national pride without slipping into selective memory. This introspective phase helped Britain develop a more nuanced identity, one that acknowledged history without being trapped by it. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Britain crafted a global role rooted in diplomacy, culture, technology, finance, and partnership rather than territorial control. Its influence was now softer, subtler, and more specialised, but still real. The empire was gone, but Britain remained a nation of considerable weight, just shaped differently. Ultimately, Britain's identity after empire became complex, layered, and adaptive. It no longer defined itself as a global overseer. Instead, it embraced a quieter kind of influence, creative, intellectual, collaborative, and international. Its cities reflected the diversity of the former empire. Its institutions carried the imprint of imperial history, but moved toward inclusive futures. Its cultural exports, from literature to music to television, captured imaginations worldwide. The empire was over, but Britain's story continued, propelled not by conquest, but by reinvention. Britain without an empire is still unmistakably British, just less globe, more introspection, less ruling the waves, more navigating modernity, less swagger, more subtlety, less empire, more conversation. The world moved on, Britain moved with it, and in doing so, it learned that identity doesn't disappear when empire ends. It evolves. In the end, the British Empire leaves behind a story too large for simple judgment, a story filled with triumphs and tragedies, innovations and errors, transformations and contradictions. It influenced nearly every region of the world, created systems that still function today, and also created problems that nations are still working to resolve. The empire shaped the modern age, but not always in the ways it intended. And now, long after the last flag was lowered, the world still carries the imprint of choices made by a country that once believed it could draw borders with rulers, govern through paperwork, and manage humanity with a stiff upper lip. Let's begin with the good news. The empire knitted together a global network of communication, trade, transportation, and law that laid the foundations for the interconnected world we live in today. English became a global language not because it was inherently superior, but because the empire spread it far and wide, and the post-imperial world found it useful for everything from diplomacy to pop music. Parliamentary systems, legal frameworks, civil service models, and educational structures travelled across continents, creating political and administrative habits that outlasted imperial rule by decades. Railways built for imperial convenience became engines of national development. Ports constructed for colonial trade became economic lifelines. Universities founded during empire became centres of learning that produced scientists, writers, activists and leaders who shaped the post-colonial world. Even cultural legacies like literature, sport and shared institutions created unexpected forms of global connection. The empire also contributed, intentionally or not, to the rise of political movements that challenged inequality and demanded rights. By introducing institutions of governance, systems of law, and access to education, it unintentionally equipped colonized people with the intellectual tools to critique, resist, and ultimately dismantle imperial authority. The world that emerged after empire was not a British creation, but it was undeniably shaped by the structures Britain had put in place. Now, the bad news: the empire's mistakes shaped the modern world too, and those mistakes were large, painful, and enduring. Economic exploitation extracted wealth from colonies, often at great human cost. Traditional industries collapsed under British economic priorities. Agricultural systems were redirected toward export markets rather than local needs. In many regions, development was uneven, designed to support imperial extraction rather than sustainable national growth. When independence arrived, many countries inherited economies that required decades of structural repair. The borders Britain left behind became the fault lines of future conflict. Drawn quickly, often with limited understanding, they forced together communities with contradictory histories and separated groups that shared deep cultural ties. Post-colonial nations have spent years attempting to navigate these artificial boundaries, sometimes successfully, sometimes through painful conflict. Social hierarchies created or intensified under colonial rule did not simply vanish. Divisions between ethnic groups, religious communities, or social classes, sometimes deliberately manipulated to reinforce control, lingered long after independence. The empire's racial ideologies left marks on identity, politics, and social cohesion. Political authority, too, bore contradictions. While Britain introduced democratic structures, it often suppressed democratic expression when it threatened imperial control, emergency laws. Censorship and political imprisonment left deep mistrust of state authority in some regions, and in others, the sudden withdrawal of British governance left power vacuums that fueled instability. The cultural consequences were equally profound. Colonised peoples grappled with the tension between reclaiming local identity and navigating institutions shaped by imperial logic. Language, literature and education became arenas where history and modernity collided. The empire had woven itself into the cultural fabric so deeply that removal was never going to be simple. And yet, despite all of this, the empire's legacy is not frozen. It continues to evolve through reinterpretation, reform, scholarship, activism, and political change. Nations once ruled from afar now shape their futures independently, blending inherited systems with local traditions to create something new, something that belongs fully to them. Britain too continues to wrestle with the legacy. The post-imperial identity is still forming, still debated, still shaped by conversations about responsibility, memory and change. Museums revisit their collections, schools update their curricula, politicians argue about the past as much as the future. The empire is gone, but the conversation about it is very much alive. History rarely offers neat endings. Empires do not truly disappear. They dissolve into influence, institutions, stories, and memories. And the British Empire, for better and worse, left an imprint that the world now works with, sometimes building upon it, sometimes dismantling it, sometimes questioning it, and sometimes discovering that something designed for Victorian bureaucracy is still sitting in the metaphorical attic. The good news? We can understand the empire now with greater clarity than ever. We can see its contributions, its connections, its unintended innovations. We can appreciate how it shaped global systems and accelerated the world's integration. The bad news? We cannot escape its mistakes simply by declaring the empire over. The problems it created, economic, political, cultural and territorial, still ripple outward. They require ongoing work, attention and honesty. And perhaps the biggest lesson is this: power fades. Ambition alters nations, but impermanence defines them. No empire, however vast, however confident, however loudly it declares itself eternal, can escape the simple truth that the world changes faster than conquerors expect. The British Empire expanded, governed, reformed, unraveled, and finally ended, leaving behind a world that must continue forward without it. The sun set. The paperwork stayed.